Hello, friends, and welcome back to the Jank Tank, episode number 26. My name is Timothy Zaccanino. I'll be hosting for you today as usual, and I've got both of the boys on the line, self-proclaimed furries on the line. Chris and Teld, they're giving me faces as if we didn't talk about this ahead of time.
Teld's been spotted in the wild. I just said that I was for moral support because he was looking real alone out there. So
I can only see his head cam right now, so we can't confirm or deny if there's a tail on that side of the line. But,
he's got like a little bunny puff like stapled to the back of his pants. We can't see it, but we know that it's there.
Speaking of which, Teld, you went to pre-release for this set yesterday, right? Or
I did,
maybe
yeah.
The day before. Were the furries out and about, or I didn't make it out myself?
You know, the LGS I went to was a little weird, but not that weird. So we managed to avoid the Furry Invasion, which was very nice.
I would have to imagine that playing an entire pre-release in costume would probably get really uncomfortable, and I also imagine that shuffling your deck would be really difficult. I can't even like zip up my own jacket when I'm wearing gloves, much less shuffle cards, so...
Well, I promised myself I would only mention furries at the top of the episode and never again, so that's it. We are talking Bloomburrow.
I make no such promises.
Chris? Bloomburrow set review. That's the name of the game today. We are going to be talking about this set from the mainline Jank Diver Cube perspective and high-level Cube in general. It's actually kind of interesting. Chris, we're going to lean on you for a couple cards here because Teld and I have actually recorded the Peasant Cube episode already, which is going to release after this one. So shit. For cards that overlap with that review, we kind of we tried to talk retrospectively, what would we have said on the the mainline Cube review for this? Not super hard, but there are a couple cards that we had little question marks about that are going to show up again today. Okay. And I'll be pointing those out and just getting your take on those as well. But we've got a pretty long episode ahead of us. Before we get into review, we got to mention two things up front. First off, Jank Diver Game in Discord. Best place on the internet, to talk about Magic the Gathering in Cube. Almost certainly the best place to talk about Cube. Mm-hmm. Come join us, come draft with us, come give us your feedback on the episodes and our Cube, and let us know what you're thinking about Bloomburrow. There are links to that Discord wherever you're listening to this podcast. I also wanted to make a very quick announcement, a personal announcement. I have been officially promoted to the managing editor of draftsim.com, which I've been a writer for them up until this point. Please clap. That's a deep cut. I've been an editor / writer for them up until this point for maybe 2 years now, and I'm officially the managing editor, which is almost a full-time job, not quite there to full-time job status, but I will be doing my best to make the content that goes out on draftsim.com the best I can, and who knows what opportunities there will be in the future. So I just wanted to announce that I'm official Magic Man at this point.
Yeah, we're one more step on the ladder of getting Tim into a employment with WotC. So he'll be doing those card designs, and then when he makes references to it, we'll know you'll know the card's coming and not just guess.
A lot of our writers bash WotC though, so I don't know what the relationship is between our website and WotC directly, but they did give us Outlaws of Thunder Junction preview cards, so it can't be that bad.
They do seem to generally prefer sycophants, though, I will say. I guess most people do, especially companies.
I'll see what future opportunities are, but I am actually pretty excited to move up with that company. They've been pretty good to me, so.
That's awesome. Congratulations, man.
Yeah,
I guess I should promote draftsim.com. Check out their content. Every single article that gets posted to that website from now on goes through me in some capacity, so if there's a problem, you come to me about it. Enough of that, though. Bloomburrow. Let's jump into this.
Would you say the elk stops here? Is that going to be what's on your desk?
I would never say that out loud. You should be ashamed of yourself. Bloomburrow set review. Again, we're talking about Cube here. We're taking a high-level approach to this, and we do have to actually go through quite a few mechanics, but I think we can kind of blow through mechanics because a lot of them aren't going to be relevant. We should touch on them, though. I think we're okay. Do I speak for all of us when I say we're all equally excited about this set and the flavor of the set?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I anticipated it as much as you guys, but once those spoilers started coming in, and I saw the art direction and the actual way that they did the set, I'm on board with it. I'm not as hyped as I was for OTJ, because that set was just pure silliness. But I'm pretty excited now to see the set. I think the card designs are sweet. The art is very adorable, and some of it's legitimately really good.
Yeah, I know Chris is one of the Redwall boys, right?
Yeah, so I read Redwall growing up. For those of you who don't know Redwall, imagine if like the Arthurian legend was sort of done in this world where all of the good guys are like mice and hedgehogs and rabbits, and all the bad guys are like weasels and lizards and stuff. It's pretty rad. Is it Brian Jacques? Is that the author's name, Tim? I think it is.
I think that's right, yeah.
But yeah, I think this was pretty clearly inspired by that. Yeah, I mean, the art is just so good. This has got to be one of the least digital looking sets. I mean, there's still a couple of pieces here and there, but this looks like the most like hand painted set in a really long time. This is easily my favorite release, just from like a surface level impression in a really long time.
Yeah, I think this is going down as my favorite of the year, and I can't imagine Duskmorn is moving me off of that. So I was also a Redwall boy. My parents made me watch Watership Down when I was like 7, so there was something going on there as well.
I read that book when I was 7.
Great book.
Yeah.
Very long book, but great book.
Yes. Yep.
Yeah, this is the cute animal kindred world, and the set design is like very straightforward. The cards, for the most part, and the mechanics are straightforward, despite there being a lot of them. Basically, you have your 10 2-color pairs. Each color pair is based around a specific creature type, like blue-red being otters, red-green being raccoons, stuff like that, and each one of those color pairs has their own mechanics. Some of them are named, some of them are not named. We've got these Imagine Courageous Critters. It's not even a bonus sheet. I think these are just going to be like thrown onto Arena as craftable cards. They took a bunch of characters and creatures from Magic's history and kind of like did a non-canonical change of what they would look like if they went to Bloomburrow. A lot of planeswalkers there, including some pretty big hitters that we're going to talk about. JTMS, Elspeth are going to come up in this review. I guess there's like this quirk on Bloomburrow if you're a human or a humanoid and you go to Bloomburrow, you like turn into a critter of some sort. That's why Ralzeric is like an otter.
Yeah, it appears to be anything that isn't natively a cute critter too, because there's one of the mythics is a dragon, right? And it turned into a bird.
Yeah. I wanted to mention the real quick, like touch on it and go. The rules changes that they've made, or rather the template and changes, they've changed enters the battlefield to enters, and we will continue to say enters the battlefield from now forever. And then they have changed the terminology pre-combat main phase and post-combat main phase to just first main phase and second main phase, which actually has caused a little bit of buzz on Twitter. I think they rolled back that they were going to do like mass errata of cards like that, but it does actually change the way some cards work with like extra combats and stuff like that. Not relevant for us, but I do like to get the logistics out of the way. Set mechanics. We have a few returning mechanics and then quite a few new mechanics, and we'll talk about the ones that are like really relevant for us in detail, but we can skip over a lot of them. Threshold is back. That's an ability that's basically online when you have 7 or more cards in your graveyard. There are no good Threshold cards in this set, so we're not going to bring that really back up. Class enchantments are back. I know Teld and I, in particular, really love class enchantments. I don't know if that's a big hitter for Chris. I was a little bit disappointed that the class enchantments from this set are very specific to like certain strategies, so we're not actually going to talk about that many, but they are kind of cool for the decks they go in. They just don't really hit for like our cube. Wanted to touch on prowess real quick because that's a deciduous mechanic. We see it all the time, but it is the blue-red otters identity here, so there might be a higher than usual number of prowess cards.
Yeah, they also took all the otters, at least at common and uncommon, and if they have prowess, they just hacked away at their stat line so that you need to trigger prowess for them to be normal-sized creatures, which is questionable. We'll see how that works out.
They made them like all individually unplayable, but maybe in like a constructed environment where you can just jam a bunch of these prowess otters together. Like maybe there's something there, but I don't quite see it. New mechanics, Valiant. Teld, do you want to tell us about Valiant real quick? That actually will come up on a card or two in this review.
Yeah, so Valiant is the red-white mouse mechanic, and it is similar to a mechanic called Heroic. Basically, the first time that it is targeted with a spell or an ability, during a turn, it triggers Valiant. That differs from Heroic, where Heroic could trigger any number of times per turn, but he had to target it with a spell. So Valiant is restricted, but much, much easier to trigger. Like, It is wildly easier to trigger, to the point that like Valiant cards in a lot of cases are just going to be playable in your cube. So yeah, there's only a couple of them that really get there for our purposes. We talked about one on the Peasant review that I think might just be the best red one drop of possibly ever printed for Peasant.
Yeah, and we will be talking about at least one that comes to mind here. Worth noting, you can trigger Valiant with things like Bristly Bill or Bone Splitter. You know what Valiant is? It's a freaking Nadu trigger. That's what Valiant is.
It's a Nadu trigger, yeah. And not twice per turn. That would be broken.
Yeah, we've got Forage here as the black-green squirrel mechanic. This basically says, like, whenever you forage, you can sacrifice a food or exile 3 cards from your graveyard. That only appears on black and green cards. I want to say we're talking about one here today, so it's worth just mentioning. It is a little weird, in my opinion, that this is coming off the back of, like, Collect Evidence as well, like 2 graveyard mechanics. But I think it's better to think of this as a food mechanic that, like, probably doesn't get there for cubes unless the card is just generically good.
I think the design on this mechanic is great because you can make good use of this in a cube that's really focused on graveyard themes and filling your graveyard specifically in green and black. But if you have a tokens theme in your cube that incorporates food, or you're doing like a food deck because you just really like that thematically or whatever, it fits in there as well. So pulls double duty. We're going to be talking about a forage card, and spoiler alert, it's not going to be on the basis of you having a bunch of food lying around. So
yeah, for our purposes, it's graveyard mechanic first, food second, though you could certainly design a cube where your forage cards are food forward. Chris, talk to me about Offspring. This is kind of the big headliner mechanic of the set.
So Offspring is a really cool mechanic. It spans all colors, and basically cards that have an Offspring cost, if you pay it when they enter, you make a 1/1 copy of the parent creature. And it also enters the battlefield, so if the creature that enters the battlefield and has an Offspring ability, if you pay it, the token also triggers that into the battlefield ability. It is always a 1/1, but if it has any attack triggers or keywords or anything like that, it retains all of those as well. So it's a cool token making mechanic for sure, and we're going to be talking about a number of these cards.
Yeah, one little thing to mention is you did say when it ETBs you Offspring, you actually can't do that when you cast. So the only time that's relevant is if your opponent has a counter spell, you do have to pay up front and get blown out.
Okay, so it's not like Intrepid Adversary. Okay, gotcha. Everything's kicker, right?
Yep. If you counter the parent, you counter the child, which kind of makes sense. I will say the one thing about Offspring that's a little off-putting to me is, like, it feels great in the context of this set, but as soon as you port it over to, like, Magic as a whole and you're mixing Offspring cards with things called, like, the Murder and the Meat Hook Massacre, like, it starts to get a little bit questionable in terms of, like, what you're doing in world, but that's again, the Vorthos players, go out there and do your work.
Oh God.
The gift mechanic. Tell me about gift here.
Yeah, so it's kicker, but you give your opponent something to get the kicker trigger. So gift spans all colors as well. The most common ones were gift a card or gift a tapped fish, or there's also like gift a food, gift a treasure on a couple of them. Now, this one you don't do when you cast. So when as the card resolves, you can choose to give them a gift, and it does that before any of the other effects on the card resolves. And if you give them the gift, you get a thing. So there's like a removal spell that lets you turn it into a Gravedigger. There's a regrowth that lets you get another regrowth. There's a bunch of cards that have gift as a mechanic. It's not really something that we really care about. And I think in most cases, gift is going to be something you have to figure out in game. Like, it's not something that I think any of the gift cards were like, I'm always gifting my opponent a card. At least when I was reading through, I don't remember any that were like that.
The way it's designed is, first off, I do want to correct something you said there. You do actually choose whether you're gifting as you cast the spell, so your opponent will know whether the gift is going to be given. While
that's not what they told us yesterday at the pre-release. So that's why I said that.
Gotcha. They designed a lot of these gift cards so that if you're getting an extra card's worth of value, the gift cost is to give your opponent a card. So often a lot of these gift cards will be 2-for-1 opportunities in your favor or greater, and those require you to gift your opponent a card. But there are lesser things like gifting them a fish or gifting them a food, or in one case, gifting them a treasure, which usually don't give you a full extra card's worth of value, and that's fine.
Anybody think that it's weird that, like, everybody gets to be people in this set except for fish?
The fish are, yeah,
there's everybody gets to be people except for fish.
There's some lore thing about fish. I guess the animals don't eat each other. Like, everybody just eats fish.
Everybody eats fish.
I was gonna say those jolly gerbils are definitely eating some fish.
Anyway, last mechanic here, just a quick one. I don't know if this one's going to come up for us or not. It's expend. This is the red-green raccoon mechanic, and it basically says, like, it's expend 4 on almost every single card, and that means when you spend your 4th mana on spells that turn, you get some sort of extra bonus. The one thing I really wanted to mention here is that it is the red-green mechanic in this set, which means that it's very, like, beat-down focused. You're getting combat-oriented bonuses most of the time. But this is the type of mechanic that I expect we'll see in the future kind of flavored differently outside of just red-green beat-down. Feels like the type of thing you can just use on a lot of different bonuses for a lot of different color pairs. So I'm looking forward to expend in the future. I don't necessarily know that there are any expend cards now that I care that much about.
Yeah. One note on the mechanics before we move forward. It just kind of occurred to me that the offspring mechanic, like, these creatures are literally bringing their children into combat, and that seems really irresponsible.
Yeah.
That's okay. You can just cast another creature and make more offspring.
Yeah.
They will coexist in a standard with cards called things like chainsaw. So again, I don't necessarily know.
God. The first time an offspring gets chainsawed, dude.
Let's go ahead and talk about some cards here. And by some cards, I mean a lot of cards. But we'll keep a brisk pace. That's our motto behind the scenes now. Keep a brisk pace. And the first one's actually pretty easy to talk about. I would like for Chris to actually talk about this one because Teld and I already talked about this Teld and I will have already talked about this on the upcoming Peasant review.
Okay, so this is Seasoned Warren Guard. It is 1 white mana for a 1/2 rabbit warrior, and whenever it attacks while you control a token, it gets +2/+0 until end of turn. This might not get there. It's a really interesting 1-drop design. As we have discovered from our own play, Ocelot Pride and Guide of Souls from MH3 are completely insane. So if you're really power maxing, there's almost certainly no room for this in your cube, but I think this is debatably better, depending on how tokensy your section is, than a lot of Savannah Lions variants that exist these days. Teld, after a lot of effort, has basically sold me on the idea that most Savannah Lions are just not really relevant creatures, and you just want maybe something that's a little less aggressive early, but converts into more value for your mana spent later, and that's kind of one of the better ways for aggro to stay and hang in the game. A 3/2 for 1's pretty good in a lot of situations, depending on how tokensy your section is. You play this on 1, you know, you attack with it for 1 if you're on the play, it gets in. Maybe it can't get in on turn 2, but then on turn 3, the number of things in white across cubes that generate some kind of tokens value goes up a lot. So if this is a 1/2 for 2 turns and then a 3/2 on attacks on turn 3, I think that's a pretty good deal. It's not a slam dunk or anything, I just like the design.
Yeah, a lot more skeptical about this card here than I was in the Peasant review that will come in the future, because they're in the Peasant cube. I think you're just almost always going to have a token by turn 3. Here, I think it's a little less of a given, but I mean, it's still probably worth testing just because a 3/2 is enough of a stat bump. That move from a 2/1 to a 3/2 is enough of a stat bump that it becomes a real creature for longer into the game.
Yeah, one mana 3/2 is enough, appealing enough for us to test this card out. But I would expect in a year's time, unless this card super impresses, that we won't be on it. But next up, we've got Jackdaw Savior. This is 2 and a white for a 3/1 rare bird cleric. It's a flyer, and it says whenever it or another creature you control with flying dies, return another target creature card with a lesser mana value from your graveyard to the battlefield. So 3 mana 3/1 stat line with flying has been pretty good, i.e. Elite Spellbinder. That card's excellent. The ability here is probably just like generically fine enough that you can just throw this in and not really care about the whole, I have to have extra flyers thing. I mean, it's a 3 mana 3/1 flyer that dies into a 2-drop or at least a 1-drop from your graveyard, and if you have other flying creatures, like, it just gets better from there. I think this one is a victim of our white 3s are just excellent at this point, and this one feels like a notch below those, but I could see a world where this is the 3-drop that you want in your section, especially if you are going out of your way to, like, make the flying matters thing, like, happen with things like Luminous Broodmoth, and there's another flying matters card we'll talk about here momentarily.
As you mentioned, white 3-drops are insanely stacked. They just, like, refuse to stop printing good ones. They just keep doing it. So I would put this one at, like, the lower end of playable for powerful cubes. I think even if you play this on curve, you probably have an opportunity to recur something, right? If you go, like, 1-drop, 2-drop, and you're just, like, attacking, maybe you trade off a creature, or your controlling opponent expends, like, a piece of cheap removal to, like, clean up your 2-drop or something. I think like the only place if you're trying to do a powerful cube, I think the only place that I could recommend this is if like small ball recursion is a theme you're trying to insinuate into your white aggressive deck as sort of like a way to distinguish white from red or something like that, make it a little stickier or whatever, then I think that's just an interesting card. But on pure power max, like it's just not really in the ballpark, I don't think.
Yeah, I do think this also is a victim of the removal power creep. So, I mean, there's more and more cards floating around now than ever that just incidentally exile this thing, from like Pillar of Flame and Obliterating Bolt in red to the various white exile effects to black graveyard hate that makes this card kind of hard to work. This card's just not going to cut it in the higher power bands, but if you're in a lower power band, you got some synergies for it. I mean, I'm sure there's stuff you can do with it. It's not bad, but I think it's in an awkward place in Modern Magic.
For sure. Only thing I wanted to add is that this card can be very obnoxious with Selfless Spirit, which is that 2-mana, 2/1 flyer that can sacrifice to protect your board. Like, you use that to protect this, and then when it dies, you get your Selfless Spirit back. Like, you just never kill your opponent's board. Teld, do you want to go ahead and talk to us about Beza?
Yeah, so this is Elk Bezos. This is the Beza.
Oh, don't call it Elk Bezos, or we can't put it in our cube. I will not think about that bald motherfucker every time somebody plays this card.
So it is 2 white for a 4/5 legendary elemental elk. And when it ETBs, you create a treasure if your opponent controls more land, gain 4 life if your opponent has more life. You get 2 blue 1/1 fish tokens if they have more creatures, and you draw a card if they have more cards in hand than you. So this is kind of the ultimate catch-up card, right? If you are behind in any facet of the game, you're going to get something meaningful. And I played against it in the pre-release, and I was very far ahead, and Beza almost single-handedly caught it up. And obviously that's retail limited, so Cube will be a little different, but still a very, very powerful card on multiple angles. I tend to like cards like this that are, I think, a little bit better when you're on the back foot. Obviously, if you get nothing off of Beza, you're so far ahead that it didn't matter. Mm-hmm. But I think most of the time, if you're on the play, because you start a card down compared to your opponent, you're probably going to be like a 4/5 that draws a card, and that's still pretty good. So it's not completely terrible on the play, but on the draw, I think it'll be really, really good.
So what I was going to ask is that a play pattern that appeals to you, that like you could be insanely far ahead, and Beza just generates an insane amount of value? But I have heard a number of people kind of mention unhappily, let's say, that it feels a lot like Magic has become a game of getting an advantage and then just pressing that advantage, and that's what the game is all about. So maybe having a button like this in your deck is actually like a good thing to keep games competitive. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, this is more a matter of like what 4-drop are we going to end up accent to play this card, because it is really good. I like what Teld said. It's a point that I added here as well, that there's kind of like no, I mean, unless you're playing against Essence Scatter, I guess there's no like bad scenario for this card, right? Because if the card comes down and none of the abilities trigger, that means you're ahead on everything. So you usually end up winning games where you're ahead on mana, cards in hand, board presence, and life, so you should be getting something, and if you don't get something, you're probably winning the game already, so that's good news too. So this is a really cool card, I guess. Encapsulating all of White's catch-up mechanics on one legendary creature is kind of cool.
I was just going to say the art is incredibly sweet. Like, I would hang this on my wall.
Yes.
Yeah, last thing about the card is I do think it's interesting, too, because against Control, where you want more cards, you're going to get cards more likely because they're going to be having more cards in hand. And against aggressive decks, where you want board presence, this card's probably going to give you board presence in life. So it plays well into the matchups, at least theory crafting. It plays well into the matchups that does the thing you want it to do in those matchups.
Any concern that this might be too good against aggro? Like 6-7 worth of stats for 4 mana and 4 life is just like the game is over against their aggro opponent.
Maybe, but like when we've played the 8-person regular, the whole cube is opened. We've had aggro, had 2 3-0s and 2 2-1s in the final in our last 4 events. So
yeah.
we've had like red aggro have a complete resurgence where it's competing with the best decks in the cube. Pretty
because we're so good at our jobs, guys. We fix red.
Yeah. All right, we're down 4-drop alley here in white. We've got another one here in
I love this card.
War Leader. Yeah, go ahead and talk about it. I was gonna talk about the next 2 actually, because you've got your pun already set up for the the bird. So
you guys make so many terrible fucking puns. I just feel left out.
What? What are you?
You guys make so many bad puns.
Just talk about the rabbit,
okay.
Man. We're not pointing fingers here.
All right, so this is a sweet rabbit with like a with a punchy shield and a big old mace that looks like a sunflower. He's also a stout gentleman. He's very jowly. His name is Warren Warleader, and he's 2 white for 4/4 with offspring for 2 generic mana. And I just love the creature type Rabbit Knight. That just makes me so happy. Whenever attack, choose one. You create a 1/1 white rabbit creature token that's tapped and attacking. Or attacking creatures you control get +1/+1 until end of turn. So I think the calling it a War Leader thing is a callback to, I don't know if anybody remembers Leonin War Leader from M19. Mm-hmm. We used to play that card a long time ago. It's basically like a bad hero of Bladehold. It's a 4/4 that makes 2 1/1 cats that are attacking when it attacks. This is significantly better for a variety of reasons, I think. It's whenever you attack. So this creature does not have to attack. You can just drop this on the board and swing, and then all of your attacking creatures get better battle cry, right? They just get anthem across the board. So this can present a bunch of damage out of nowhere. Or you can also just generate the token when your free drop attacks, kind of similar to Adeline's patterns. And if you are later in the game and you offspring this, not only do you get 5/5 worth of stats across 2 bodies, which is great, but a double antheming your board on attacks, or making another 1/1 and antheming your whole board, or whatever, is going to be a really, really, really powerful swing. So unlike War Leader that has to attack itself and only creates tokens and doesn't have this offspring clause, like this just represents a meaningful upgrade to me in every single way. And in your tokens decks, there's going to be turns when you have 5 or 6 critters on board and you just drop this and create like 5/5 or 6/6 of stats on attacks and kill your opponent after they made maybe calculated attacks where they didn't think that they were in a position where you could kill them, and then all of a sudden you can. I think this card's potent, personally.
I have high hopes for it. Teld, it sounded like when we discussed it off air that you were a little bit lower on it than us.
Yeah, I think I was at first. I think I've come around a little bit on this. I was, I guess, a little bit worried about your opponent just killing it before combat, or it being just the kind of card that jet mirrors the game, but it doesn't get trample, doesn't get vigilance. There's a lot more play to this. I was just a little bit worried about it kind of having the game ends or does nothing text, which we generally try to avoid. But I think overall this card is going to be good, but I'm not as low on it as I was when we first talked about it.
Yeah, I think the thing that leads me to believe this card will just be excellent is how well Intrepid Adversary plays out, right? Because on 4, like you do get to just do the thing where you play it on 4, you anthem your board, and then even playing Intrepid Adversary on 6 is very similar to playing this with Offspring, and Adversary has just held up as far as like the board pump goes.
Yeah, it's a lot worse on defense because Adversary sometimes just pumps your board and lets you block really well. But yeah, I mean you want to be aggressive, but this is doing a similar thing. Yeah,
as far as the like, will my card just get picked off and not do anything dynamic? I think like it's going to happen sometimes, obviously, but that card holds its own, for 4 and 6 mana, and I think this is comparable at least.
I don't think many people with 360 are going to want to play this and Hero of Bladehold if they're still on that card, because they're similar-ish, so I think maybe the question for some people is going to come down to which is better, and I honestly don't know how to answer that question because I've never played with Hero of Bladehold. This has more edges on it.
In Modern Magic, I think Hero of Bladehold being a 3/4 that does nothing on the turn you play it is like a death knell. I don't think you can play a card that just does literally nothing. At least this, you get to attack, you can pump your board, or you can make a dude to like go wide. The immediate impact is probably better than the higher untapped ceiling of Hero of Bladehold.
Yeah, I think you're probably right. I mean, I might be on this being, at least on paper, because I haven't played with either yet. I think on paper, the versatility on this, I think I might like this better than Hero. So if you've been playing Hero for a long time and maybe your white 4-drop section is a little stale, like maybe consider this, because it definitely has some different angles, but has kind of a similar role.
Chris, question for you. Is the bird the word?
Are you talking about Nesto Angel?
Yes, I am asking about Nesto Angel.
Okay, so Nesto Angel, also known as Salvation Swan, which is way less cool of a name, is 3 and a white for a 3/3 flash flying bird cleric. Whenever it or another bird you control enters, which is kind of like flavor text, I think, for most cubes. So let's just shortcut to whenever it ETBs, exile up to 1 creature you control without flying, return to the battlefield under its owner's control with a flying counter on it at the beginning of the next end step. So this is another one of those things, like we just mentioned, with the War Leader, where I think most 360s are probably not going to want to play this and Restoration Angel because of the sort of superficial similarity of the effects. So notably, this can only blink something that doesn't have flying. So if your opponent is like targeting your big dragon or your selfless spirit or whatever else, something you want to keep on board, Salvation Swan can in fact not save it. The other difference is that the creature returns to the battlefield under its owner's control at the beginning of the next end step. That edge will, like on a spell that flickers a creature, can protect it from like wraths, right? Mm-hmm. But I don't think you want to flash in your 4-cost 3/3 flyer to get another flyer off board for the swan to die in a wrath and then have that creature come back. It is nice that the creature gets permanent flying. Actually, on my first read, I didn't even pick up on the fact that it can't save creatures with flying, which I think is another mark against the card. So anyway, in conclusion, a creature coming back with a flying counter is nice. I don't like that, unlike Resto Angel, this does not have unmitigated, unlimited targeting. Resto Angel has 4 points of toughness, which is huge if you're just using Resto Angel to ambush things in combat. The difference between 3 and 4 toughness when you're trying to eat something in combat versus trade is enormous, especially since like every aggressive 2-drop in the game has 3 power now. Not to mention the fact that Resto Angel's ability to immediately flicker something means that you can immediately get any ETB value on that creature when you need it right now. And it can also serve to untap a creature that your opponent thought was not available for blocks when they choose to attack. Overall, my take on this is I think Resto Angel is probably, just for most cube environments, just going to be stronger. Salvation Swan having the upside of permanent flying on whatever you blink is nice, but I think the reduced toughness and the timing on the flicker actually fucks with a lot of the utility that people use Resto Angel for in most combat scenarios.
I am on board with saying, I think that, I mean, this is a better proactive card. Like, you'll put this in an aggro deck. You don't usually put Resto in aggro decks, though you can. Like, it's fine if you do, but it's usually like a 23rd card scenario there. Where, Resto does go in defensive decks, though, and you don't want this in, like, a control deck or anything like that. So I think this card is better than Resto in a small percentage of decks, but Resto's just universally better in more decks.
It's okay. I think it's kind of weird that we're getting... I don't want to say strictly worse, but, like, functionally speaking, this is just strictly worse Restoration Angel, like 10 years after Restoration Angel was printed, which is weird. It obviously has some edges, and, like, it's cool for Standard to have this effect, but... Yeah, I don't know. We've got Restoration Angel, so why I don't care about this card.
We fiddled around with that Glorious Protector one from the Foretell Restoration Angel as well, and that card ended up just being worse than Resto. But Resto, one of the few like relics of the past that still kind of stands up. Speaking of, we've got a really cool reprint here, and I wasn't actually sure if we were going to get this card, but it does look like it'll be on Arena, so it is worth talking about it here. Elspeth Sun's Champion, a card we've mentioned years ago now that we would really appreciate on the client. I wonder, what do you guys think about actually getting it now? Will it hold up, with, multiple years of power creep behind us?
Why don't they just give us the original arts of cards when they give us these arts? Sorry, my note, and this might prick a couple people the wrong way, but my joke here is that Magic's getting a little too inclusive. Because we have Mouse Elspeth, and I promise I'm not going to say it again when we get to Furry Fox Jace. I am wondering what the soldier tokens that this thing spits out are going to look like.
Okay. Unlike Furry Fox Jace, I do actually think they hit the this is adorable spot for
they did. Card. They did. Jace is the one that bothers me the most, mostly because I had a friend in. He's been my friend my whole life, but one of his first graphic design assignments when he got out of college was he was commissioned by Anthrocon to make a flyer for them, and the dude on the front is wearing like a blue fox costume, and I just like see the Jace and I just like flash back to my friend Justin's first job.
Yeah, I don't vibe with the Jace. I think it looks it's in that furry uncomfortable spot for me, but like this is safely in the adorable mouse anthropomorphic mouse thing.
Sure.
Anyways, as to the card itself, I think for 6 mana, it's really... You need your card to take over the game kind of immediately. We're going to probably try Elspeth, and I think if you untap with it, it's going to be really good. But the minus effect, I expect to be worse than it's ever been, because there's just more like small to mid-sized creatures in Cube.
We're talking about the card as if everybody knows what Elspeth Sun's Champion does. We should probably read it. It's 4 white for a 4 loyalty Planeswalker, and the +1 is... Create 3/1/1 soldiers, -3 is destroy all creatures with power 4 or greater. And then actually achievable -7 is you get an emblem where all of your creatures get +2/+2 and flying.
Yeah, so I mean, there's more trample, there's more flying than there's ever been. There's a lot of mechanics that are going to punish this card, but I will say one of the problems control decks when they still struggle with is like when they get stuck in a spot where they're not leveraging every turn, they're not generating an advantage, right? And that doesn't happen as much anymore, especially since they've moved into smaller creatures where they can get ahead earlier into the game. But this card, like if you get into a top deck with your opponent and they brick like one turn, you're probably winning the game, right? You're just gonna have so many dudes in play that even if they kill the Elspeth, you're just gonna have enough guys in play that you probably can kill them. So the upside's still there on the card. It's just hard to say whether like 6 mana is going to be too much. And I think also if you're playing in a purely power max environment, I do also wonder if this card's like how this card compares with the Eternal Wanderer, because we don't play that card mostly for a play pattern thing, but in terms of power level, that card's also exceptionally powerful.
I think the Eternal Wanderer is almost certainly stronger these days. I think that card's, as Teld mentioned, incredibly frustrating. It's powerful, it's frustrating, the design sucks, just everything about that card sucks. This is almost certainly less powerful, but I will say that shitting out 3 bodies a turn is a lot to churn through. It's going to be very difficult for your opponent to kill you in combat immediately if they don't have a lot of evasion. And I like that the plus is really powerful against aggressive decks that are trying to attack you to kill you, and that the -3 cleans up really large creatures if that's what your opponent is doing. My guess would be that this is like a C+ card in Contemporary Magic. I don't think that this is the powerhouse that it used to be, but I do want to try it.
Yeah, you don't really see this one floating around like Vintage Cube anymore or anything like that. The one thing that does give me a little bit of hope that it might fit our cube is how well specifically Grave Titan and Inferno Titan have behaved themselves in our cube, which I mean, those cards are a little bit better as far as like the stabilization of the board goes, but I do kind of lump them into an era of Magic where Elspeth, Sun's Champion, was like an excellent card, so it gives me a little bit of hope that like as a 6-drop card that this can still hold up in our cube. But Power Maxed, I don't think this gets there at all
anymore. Yeah, the other thing that I do like about this card is I think that this is like a perfectly reasonable thing to play as like a finisher in your control deck. But I also like that if you're playing like a green-white tokensy strategy that's maybe on the more mid-rangey end, like less low curving, maybe you're playing green mana dorks, to get to it a little faster. I like this as a top-end piece for that, especially considering all of the ways that white has to anthem creatures now. Like, and playing Elspeth Sun's Champion onto a board where your wedding announcement has flipped is really insane. I mean, that's more a commentary on wedding announcement, but yeah, I think this card will be solid. I don't expect it to be like a world beater, as Teld says.
In the tokens deck, you're also more likely to not be super far behind on board when you slam your 6-mana card, which, again, the control decks are playing differently these days, so that doesn't happen as often either. But, you know, your green-white deck is probably playing pretty heavily to the board, where this card's going to add to that in a pretty meaningful way. And if you've got a bunch of small creatures, your opponent's like threatening you with a questing beast or, you know, some 1 or 2 big creatures, being able to come down and minus it and then open up attacks is also really good for you. So yeah, this is a card we wanted for a while. So I mean, we're obviously going to test it, and hopefully it'll be pretty good.
We've got another potential white top end card here to talk about. It's Season of the Burrow. So I didn't mention the paw print thing at the top of the episode in mechanics because it's not really a mechanic. It's just a cheeky thing they put on this cycle of mythics. But Season of the Burrow is 3 white for a sorcery, and it says choose up to 5 paw prints worth of modes. You may choose the same mode more than once, and then all of these seasons have a 1 paw print mode, a 2 paw print mode, and a 3 paw print mode. So you could go like the 2 mode and the 3 mode together, or you could do the 1 mode 5 times. You get to mix and match until you spend up to 5 paw prints worth of modes. But the modes here, for a single paw print, you can create a 1/1 rabbit. For 2, you can exile target non-land permanent and its controller draws a card. And then for 3, you return a permanent with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield with an indestructible counter on it. We talked pretty extensively about this one behind the curtain and kind of came down on saying, like, it's hard to figure out what, like, the default for this card would be. And it is flexible. It's flexible in that, like, you can do a lot of different things depending on what the board state looks at. But as far as modality on cards like this go, you kind of usually want there to be a clear signal on what you should do kind of generically with nothing else going on. But this one doesn't, I don't know what is the default mode 5 mana for 5 1/1s? Because, like, that doesn't actually read like that powerful. Maybe it's exile a permanent and make 3/1/1s. Like, we're going to talk about another one of these later where there's a clear default, like what you put the card in your deck for, and you can adjust accordingly. This one's a little bit harder to wrap my head around as far as, like, what am I putting this in my deck for? Or am I just playing it because it's flexible depending on the situation?
You highlighting this in our pre-review discussion kind of created a new heuristic for me. I think you're right. I think when you look at one of these modal cards, generally speaking, what you need to see on the card is this collection of modes is going to be solid value 90% of the time, but I also get to do this other stuff if the situation demands it. I think the best mode on the card is make 2 1/1s and recur a 3-drop that has like engine-y characteristics with an indestructible counter on it. And if you do that, it's really powerful. But it does require you to have a card worth spending a hunk of this card's value to recur. Mm-hmm. And we've all played enough Magic to know that recursion cards, even in theory, if that should be the case, like recursion cards, like sometimes there's just nothing going on in the graveyard. It just happens sometimes. If your opponent has brought any amount of graveyard hate, or there hasn't been that much trading in the game for whatever reason, and you're both building up to a board stall. I mean, the exiling mode is like kind of nice because it's non-land permanent, but I think anytime you're exiling anything like smaller than a 4-drop creature, and your opponent gets a card off of it, and you spent 2/5 of your card's value on that, I don't think that's good.
Okay, so real quick, something I had not considered until just now, the 1/2/2 mode. How does that sound? Like, exile 2 non-land permanent to your opponent controls. They draw 2 cards, and you make a 1/1, but it's basically like, make a 1/1 that double kills 2 of your opponent's creatures. Is that good enough for 5 mana?
I was just thinking about that same mode, and I don't think it is, but if it is a good bit of tempo, especially if you hit like a 3 and a 4 or something like that, you're kind of giving up a card at that point to do it because your opponent draws 2 cards. But if you exile 2 relevant cards, I mean, their draw steps are going to contain 40% lands, right? So you know you're going to be giving them land some percentage of the time. I think this card just suffers from like all the modes sound fine, but I don't really want to spend 5 mana and a card to do it.
Yeah, this is a cube equity thing for me, right? Like, it's competing with other 5-drops, and I'm going to default to the other 5-drops that I know do the thing every single time. So if I were drafting someone else's cube and this card was in the cube, I'm sure I would take it, draft it, and play it. But I don't think we're going to cut a card for it, which does lead us to our final white card, which is Starfall Invocation. It's 3 white for a rare sorcery. It has gift a card, and again, that means your opponent will draw a card. The effect of the card, destroy all creatures. If the gift was promised, return a creature card put into your graveyard this way to the battlefield under your control. So, as you mentioned, this is kind of like a time wipe. They've been doing this with Wraths a lot lately, where it's like, Wrath the board, but I'll be the one who's left with something on board. And yeah, you have to give your opponent a card to do that, but, being able to Wrath the board and have the board presence up afterwards, kind of nice. So, I think this is a cool little Wrath. I'm not sure if you guys think it's actually, like, cubable for us. Compared to the rest that we're already playing, but it's an interesting take on just like a normal sweeper effect.
It's fine. I think it is. I mean, obviously it's worse than Sunfall, but that's such a high bar that I'm not really going to worry with it. I mean, I'm not big on Wraths in general. I think they're fine. This one, I mean, paying an extra mana means you need to be getting a card back a reasonable percentage of the time. And then you have to ask, like, what cards are worth giving your opponent a card to get back that you're playing in, presumably your white-based control deck. And so then you start getting into this narrow band of stuff, because I don't know if I want to give my opponent a card, even if I can bring back my 2-drop, unless it's, I mean, maybe Malcolm.
Yeah. Needs to be a 3-drop or above, probably. And then also, if you are a control deck and you're not getting a creature back, this is just 5 mana for a 4 mana effect.
Yeah, and then when you look at the 3 mana cards that you'd have access to in your white or blue deck, if we assume that we're like a blue-white control deck, they're still, I mean, it's like Svalin, and that's the only one that we actually want to buy back, because most of the other ones are utility creatures, right? I mean, Elite Spellbinder, if you've got access to it, is obviously pretty good.
That's a fun one to bring back, too, because you can you gift them the card, and then you bring your Spellbinder back, and you peek at their hand.
Yeah, I mean, and then Blade Splicer, I guess, is okay, but I don't think any of the rest of them are 3-drops that our control decks are going to be playing. So I actually think the band of cards that you're going to have access to is relatively limited here, too.
Yeah, speaking of like band of creatures, etc., one of the other things that I don't like about this card, just from a design standpoint, is like people already occasionally put wraths in decks that they shouldn't. I know that that's a value judgment, but it's one that I'm willing to make. And don't get me wrong, when they when they do it, sometimes it turns out to be right. But like, I'm sure you guys have been like in the aggressive creature matchup, and then you get like Wrath of God in turn one, and you're just like, what the fuck? And I feel like this is the kind of card that people might feel encouraged to like main in their white mid-range deck. And there's going to be times when that's really, really good because you have a Wrath in a deck that, like, from a theoretical construction standpoint, kind of shouldn't have one. And it's one of the things that I didn't like about Settle the Wreckage is you can just bring it in the creature matchup and like completely shatter parity with a card that doesn't really belong in your theoretical deck design. And I think Starfall Invocation might actually be maybe not as egregious, but like pretty nasty example of that. Like if somebody just mains this in their like green-white mid-range creature deck and they don't play a control deck all night, like I guarantee you like once or twice they're just gonna like wrath the board and like keep their questing beast, and it's gonna piss everybody off. I just don't like anything about this card.
Yeah, when you start getting to 4 and 5 mana creatures, also this card gets really good. I also want to just say for the audience, Chris said turn 1, but clearly meant game 1 because turn 1 is
game one,
impossible and not particularly
bad.
advisable in our cube. Yeah,
We're lotusing out our Wrath on turn 1.
Yeah, you start with 3 Lotuses in your hand and Adeline in this.
But I agree with everything you said about it being kind of a miserable card to have access to for creature mirrors, where you can just kind of main deck this and mise people with it. Yeah, I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. Depending on like, I'm not going to make the value judgment that that's something you shouldn't do. It's just something that we personally don't like to do.
All right, moving into blue. Teld, talk to us about Kitza Otterball Elite.
Yeah, so this is Kitza Blitzball Prodigy. We are clearly playing Blitzball. This is a 1 in a blue for a 1/3 legendary otter wizard with vigilance and prowess. You can tap it to draw a card, then discard a card. So it's got the Merfolk Looter text. And then you can pay 2 and tap Kitza to copy target instant or sorcery spell you control, choose new targets, and activate only if its power is 3 or greater. So I'm just going to say that I think this might be the best card in the set. This card seems like you could put a Modern Horizon symbol on it. It'd be really good. You could remove that entire last paragraph of text about copying spells and it would still be good. But add on to that, it becomes very, very powerful. So kind of playing through the play patterns of this. First of all, it's a prowess vigilance looter. So you can attack with it. You can threaten prowess spells with your opponent if you've got instant speed cantrips or removal spells. Makes it very difficult in the early to mid game to be able to know how you're supposed to block this. On top of that, after you attack, you've still got access to looting. So this is applying pressure while also, or blocking, while also churning through your deck. And then the third line of text, or fourth line of text about copying spells. When you first read it, sounds like you have to have cast your third spell for the turn to copy it, which means it would be too expensive to ever realistically do it. But what this actually does, because the way prowess and trigger stacking works, is we can put the prowess trigger on the stack for the second spell we cast, resolve it, and now Keith's power is 3, and we can copy. So in the early game, it's going to be kind of hard to do this, I think. But, I mean, we play a lot of 1-mana spells, and the decks that I expect this is going to be at its best in are going to play a lot of 1-mana spells to begin with. And on top of that, this is just another card that continues to show why Mishra's Bauble is such a ridiculous Magic card. You can play Mishra's Bauble, pump this to a 2/4, and then you cast your first instant sorcery spell in the turn, and you can copy it pretty cheaply. Yeah, just all around, this card feels like it is just incredibly powerful. It's the best looter, I think, in a long line of looters. I thought Malcolm was the best looter for a while, but I think this is almost certainly got to be better, right? Or at least comparable.
I think this card's probably better. I think this is going to be the best looter that we have. Though, I guess if you take away, like if you just put it in a non-spellsy deck, like it's probably not as good. But it is worth noting as well, if you can just naturally get Keatsa's power up to 3, even without prowess, with like a Bone Splitter or some +1/+1 counters, like a Bristly Bill or something like that. Like you can just freely activate this ability, in which case you're probably just winning the game by a landslide when you're just paying 2 mana to copy every single instant and sorcery you cast.
This is going to be so ridiculous in like Balmor decks in Brawl. It's going to be so stupid.
Oh yeah, first spell gets it to 3 power, and then you're just going off from there.
Oh man, the cocaine draw of like turn 2 Kitza, turn 3 Bristly Bill, fetch land, pump Kitza to 3 power, and then next turn you're just like you've got 4 mana and just the world is yours.
See that it's funny because like you don't really think of looters that much in like Simic territory, but you do usually have a spell or two floating around, and like I don't know, you could just put a 1/3 Vigilant Prowess looter in a deck, even if you don't care that much about prowess, and then sometimes like you'll have your Trash the Town or Tyvar stand or whatever, and you'll be like, okay, my dude is just big because I'm playing green, and I will copy my Tyvar stand or whatever.
Overprotect? Copy Overprotect?
Yeah.
That's the first time that happens to me. I'm just going to quit Magic. The last thing I just wanted to throw in as a note here is that because it loots, you could go into combat, get it blocked, and loot towards getting another cheap spell to get like that last line of text to trigger. Like the looting will actually help you find the tools to actually do that on top of everything else. Not in the same like combat, obviously.
Yeah. Okay, I was gonna say you have to tap it for both.
No. Not in the same card, but like, or not in the same turn. But I mean, maybe the putting it in the combat example is bad. But you get my point. Like the looting is actually going to help you find the tools to enable the more powerful line. Obviously, like this is going to be a lot stronger and proactive is it decks than it's going to be in control decks. But 1/3 Vigilance Prowess Looter is going to be good in basically any blue deck that's not like splashing blue for a couple things.
Yeah. We got another sweet one. This one's a lot simpler, though. Chris, Teld and I have already talked about this card. I'm sorry, Teld and I will have already talked about this card. I'm going to stop doing that now. Talk to me about the 2-drop here.
This is Plume Creed Escort. It is 2 mana, 1 and a blue for a 2/1 with flash and flying. And when it ETBs, target creature you control gains hexproof until end of turn. So I don't know if Rattle Chains has other text, but Rattle Chain is an old Spirits card that's 1 and a blue for a 2/1 flash flyer that when it ETBs, target spirit becomes hexproof until end of turn. And this just does it for literally anything. We've talked on the show a lot about blue aggro control. Obviously, I'm a big fan of the archetype. I think the other boys are into it too. And this is just exactly the card that you want. I mean, this is sort of like dive down on a 2/1 flash fire. I think the first time that your opponent goes to like Doomblade your Brazen Borrower that's beating them to death in the air, and you just like flash in another 2 evasive power to add onto the clock and blank their card, that's just crazy value for 2 mana. And one card that I wanted to note is there was a card back in the day. It was in the latest Innistrad block called Spectral Adversary, and that was a 2/1 flash flyer for 2. But it had a mode where you could pay 2 extra mana multiple times, and each time you did, you phased out a creature and put a +1/+1 counter. I think it was phase out another creature. And put a +1/+1 counter on Spectral Adversary. And obviously this is like a different card, but this is basically what you want Spectral Adversary to do, except it's free. If that makes any sense. Like you're never sinking 6 mana into Spectral Adversary. Like best case scenario, you're just sinking in 4. And the fact that this just kind of does what you want Spectral Adversary to do, but doesn't actually really do every single time for 2 mana consistently, this is just a disgusting aggro control card. It's just really good.
Well, this is gonna be the old Simic Bant cocaine card. This is just like great in your not just in the aggro control shell. I think it's generally the best version of the deck, but cheap evasive creatures with flash protection spells, counter spells, and you're just playing this like tempo game, and you're trying to get your opponent dead. And this fits right in, right? Yeah. Your opponent goes to kill your Bristly Bill or something, and you protect it, and now you've got more power in play. You've got another body to put counters onto and that sort of thing, to set up your repulsive mutation and stuff like that. So, yeah, I think this card's going to be really good there. It'll be good in Is It, probably. Though those decks are sometimes running a lower creature count, so maybe a little less good there. Slower blue decks, I think, are going to be less interested in this, but I mean, it's kind of hard for 2 mana. You could just kind of view this as like you said, like a dive down that comes with a 2/1, and there's some flexibility there that means it might just be playable everywhere. Could also be, this is one other thought, White has a lot of value engines that are very powerful to protect, stuff like Delny, stuff like Soul Herder, and things like that. It could be really good to pair there with those powerful value engines.
Yeah, I could see putting this in like a blue-white blink deck to protect like your Soul Herders and your Delnys and shit of the world. Basically, like any deck who's planning to win with creatures that wants to play instant speed effects is going to want this card.
Sweet card for an uncommon. Could have easily been
clean too.
The 2/1 flash flyers will continue until morale improves.
Improves, yeah.
Okay, next up we have my little buddy here. Thundertrap Trainer is 1 in a blue for a 1/2 rare Otter Wizard. It has Offspring 4, and it says when this creature enters, look at the top 4 of your library. You may reveal a non-creature, non-land. From among them, put it in your hand, put it on the bottom. So I kind of went to bat for this card a little bit. I'm just going to come out and say, like, I am lower on this card than I was when we all initially talked about it. I don't think it's actually blanket good. It actually seems a little bit weaker than that. I just really like this card. I like the design of it. I think it is stronger than people are giving it credit for, but I do think it could have used like a prowess type ability. So, I mean, 2 mana for a 1/2. Obviously, that stat line is weak. Obviously, this can miss. I know there's like the whole Augur of Bolus joke where, oh, let's you look at the bottom 3 cards of your library. But looking at 4 and finding any non-creature, you should hit in the decks that you're putting this in like a fairly large percentage of the time, to the point where I could consider this just a 2 for 1. Like, if I'm putting it in my deck, I'm going to think it's a 2 for 1.
Augur is also instant or sorcery, so like Thundertrap hits planeswalkers and artifacts, and you're probably not going to miss with this if you.
This could hit your Invasion of Tarkir and stuff like that as well.
Yeah.
6 mana obviously is a lot for. I mean, that's a lot of mana. Like, it does make me wish this had something else going on, because I do think that's powerful if it resolves and you're not just like dead to combat damage, right? Like 2 bodies on board, regardless of what stat line they have. And drawing your next 2 like spells from among a stack of like 8 cards. I do think that's more powerful than people are giving it credit for, but you know, we can't ignore the fact that this is a 2 mana 1/2 or 6 mana for a 1/2 plus a 1/1 that draws 2 cards. Like, that's just probably a little bit too weak. So I think we all agreed this card probably had like prowess, steer, and set design, which would have made it way better, or was a 2/2 or something like that. And it needed like one other push somewhere, whether that was shaving a mana off of Offspring or an extra keyword or an extra stat or something. So I like the card. I am not going out of my way to like say that it's a must play and it's a great card or anything like that. I just kind of like it, and I think it's a little bit better than people give it credit for.
I really like the design too. It just feels like a card that like maybe they had some trouble balancing in testing, and so they were conservative with it. I mean, you could say like if they gave it 3 toughness, that's just like strictly better than Augur of Bolus, but like who gives a shit? It's 2024 and this is a rare. Yeah. You know, I think if the main body had the capability of successfully blocking like anything, I'd be more interested. I think maybe if the Offspring cost was maybe 1 mana cheaper, I might be a little bit more interested, but it feels like they played it really safe.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I keep going back to, in my head, the thing that I'm trying to say to justify is like, look at Spirited Companion, you know, but the fact that Spirited Companion is a body for the white decks is more important than the fact that this is a body for the blue decks. So
big difference.
They're comparable in terms of like cantrip creature, and this one even has like way better late game utility, but it just remains that like a 1/2 body is not what you need, and like in your control deck for sure, like a 1/2 just isn't blocking that well, and you don't really want to tap out 6 mana sorcery speed for the full effect in a control deck, which leaves this to the prowessy decks where we're also talking about cards like Kitsa Otterball Elite in the same exact set. So it's kind of hard to justify using a 2-drop slot on this.
Yeah, I think you guys summed up most of my feelings on it. Like, I may have been a little harsh on this card when when we first talked about it, but yeah, I think it's just a little too conservatively designed. I think if you put this in your cube, it's not something that I'm gonna be like, why is this in your cube? You know, it obviously is a fine enough card that you can play it in some environments. I just don't really think it gets over the bar of our 2-drops. Like, it's the cube equity discussion, right? Is like, I don't think this card is better than any of the 2-drops we're running, and so I'm inclined to say that it's probably just not something worth considering.
Yeah. Thanks for not bullying.
You know, I think if this ends up being relevant in some kind of constructed context, it's probably going to be because it has these effects and also that it's a wizard. But then again, actually, Kitsa is a wizard too. So I don't know. This didn't quite get there for me.
It's probably better than our next card, though. If I'm being honest, I think it's probably just better.
I don't know, but I guess we'll talk about it.
I'm being hyperbolic now. Jace the Mind Sculptor, anyone? Finally on the client, it's a fox.
Yeah,
Foxy Jace.
Like,
I'm pleased to have it.
Several years too late, but yeah, I'm glad to have it.
Do we have to read? We have to read Jace for the Zoomers, right? Like,
yeah, we do.
There's people out. Okay, real quick. Jace the Mind Sculptor, very classic card. 2 blue, 3 loyalty, planeswalker, 4 abilities, +2. Look at the top card of target player's library. You may put it on the bottom or leave it on top. The 0 is Brainstorm. Draw 3, then put 2 cards from your hand on top of your library. -1. unsummon, return a creature to its owner's hand, and then -12 ultimate, exile all cards from target player's library, then that player shuffles their hand into their library. So just classic, used to be like de facto one of Blue's best cards. Talk to me about it. Where does it land in modern day Magic in a cube like ours?
Well, it's no longer banned in Modern.
No longer played in Modern, actually.
No longer played in Modern. Yeah, well, it's funny. My brother, I can't remember, it was like Modern Masters something, blah, blah, blah. And it was like right when it became clear that like Jace was going to get unbanned in Modern. And like the first Masters pack he ever opened in his life, he pulled a Jace the Mind Sculptor and he promptly sold it to somebody for like $125. And I mean, what is it worth now? Like 10?
$5-10, something like that.
Yeah, so the minus to return a creature to its owner's hand is like not a strong interaction mode anymore because everything has haste or does something when it ETBs, like literally everything. Brainstorming and returns, fine. Honestly, the most powerful thing that the card can do realistically is you just keep looking at the top of your opponent's library, and if you see like a land, you leave it there, and if you see good action, you just bottom it.
Yeah, the game is over with this card. The historical thing is the game is over with this card when your opponent leaves a card on top. And that's, I don't necessarily know if that's exactly true anymore, but it's probably close to being true, right? Where if you get this card, you untap with it, and you're able to plus it, and you go, okay, opponent, I'm going to leave you a land on top. You've got 2 cards in hand. I've got, my counter spell is ready to go. You're probably winning the game. I just think that those board states are going to be harder to get to in Modern Magic than it used to be.
Yeah, I would not be shocked if I saw this in a pack next to, like, Kefnet, and I wasn't sure what I was going to take. If we were still playing Stoic Sphinx and I saw this in a pack next to Stoic Sphinx, I know exactly what I would take. And it's not this.
It's just a fact of the matter that Planeswalkers have more competition these days than they did when these cards were. Like, this and Liliana of the Veil come to mind as, like, those classic Planeswalkers that are no longer, like, top 5 walkers because they don't really protect themselves that well. There's just more ways to kill a Planeswalker straight up with removal. There's more haste creatures that do stuff like that. So, it used to be the joke that I think Blood Braid Elf was the Jace the Mind Sculptor killer. And, like, now we have cards like Quest and Beast and just all sorts of haste threats that can take this down the turn it comes down. So I think we kind of agreed this is not going to be a top-tier blue card, but it's too classic not to play for us, given that we haven't had it before in our environment, and should still hold up. Like, even if it does end up being a B tier card, like, B tier cards are still fine. They're not, like, hellaciously bad or anything like that, so.
Yeah, I don't expect this to be bad, to be clear. I don't think I'm going to see this in a pack and be like, fuck yeah, I'm playing blue. You know?
It used to be you open this in Vintage Cube, and, like, there were a lot of packs where this would just be, like, an exciting first pick in Vintage Cube, and we're just nowhere near those days anymore.
Yeah. We'll see how this one lands. It's an exciting card to pick up. Like, I know we're down talking it a tiny bit, but it is an exciting card for our cube. A little more exciting than something like Elspeth, for sure. Teld wanted to make a quick furry note and justify the fact that he's not a furry, and then we got a couple cards to close out.
Yeah, I also had the really lame, what does the fox sculpt? It's minds. For people who are old enough to remember that awful meme.
Those like 2014, they'd be like 10.
Look, I'm showing my age a little bit, okay? I was in college.
I was actually leading you into the next card, not the, what does the fox say?
Oh, yeah. This next card is, it's Run Away Together, which is a reprint, and I only wanted to mention it because the art is really uncomfortable. It's like an otter and a frog sailing away together, and they don't want to be found, and it's like really romantic-y looking, and it's really weird for implications, and I don't really want to think about it, but the art is utterly adorable, and it almost makes me forget about how uncomfortable that makes me feel.
Yeah, Teld only wanted to talk about this card and like talk about how it makes him uncomfortable because he just doesn't want everybody to know how ridiculously turned on he is. So
again, we can only see the top half of Teld.
The art on this card is extremely, extremely cute. Like, I think I want this in my bathroom.
It is really, really cute. I have to admit.
He's got Beza on the wall in his living room, and then he's got this in the.
Dude, I told you, I love the art in this set.
You go to his bed, and he's got Meat Hook Massacre pinned above his headboard.
You got a little altar with Yawgmoth, a picture of Yawgmoth on it.
Yeah.
When my brother was living here, he got a print of Village Rites, and not the original one. It's the one where the guy's like being crucified on a bunch of iron bars or whatever, and he's screaming. And my brother moved out, and I just walked in, and that was on the wall, and I was like, well, what the fuck am I gonna do with this? Like, I'm not trying to scare the hose. Like, I'm not hanging this up in my living room. Like, it's stuffed into a closet somewhere. But this, you could hang this in your home. If people would find it inviting.
This is another one of those pictures that are art pieces that looks directly out of like a children's storybook. I mentioned that in the future. I'll have mentioned that about Head of the Homestead. But this is in that same sort of art space where it's very like looks like maybe watercolored or like sketched or whatever. It's very, very nice.
It's very reassuring in a world that is completely and utterly falling apart around us.
We have a class to talk about here, and I actually think this is a really interesting card, and the type of card that, like, if we didn't talk about it, and this, it's like, oh, Blue Red Otters just won a Pro Tour, we'd be like, man, why, how did we miss that card? But Storm Chaser's Talent is a blue mana for a class enchantment, and level 1, when it enters, you create a 1/1 blue and red otter token with prowess, which I think we all agreed is not good enough on its own. A 1/1 prowess for 1 is just not a good enough card. To get it to level 2, you pay 3 and a blue, and it says when this class becomes level 2, return target instant or sorcery from your graveyard to your hand. And if this card ends up seeing play or being played or being cubable, it's probably going to be on the back of level 2. And then level 3 is kind of throwaway text. It's 5 and a blue. Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery, you make another 1/1 prowess otter. So I think we can evaluate this as if level 3 doesn't exist because you're talking about 11 mana at that point. But what do you guys think of 1/1 prowess that you can later dump 4 mana into to regrowth a spell? The numbers are high there. The numbers are pushed a little bit high in terms of mana cost for what you're getting, but it does front you like a little prowess creature up front.
I really wanted to like this card. When it was spoiled, I got kind of hyped about it because it was like, I was like, oh man, 1 mana effect. We can potentially, rebuy it or whatever. It's giving us a spot as a prowess dude. And it's got Snapcaster Mage text or Cyber Siphoner text. Really excited about it. And then we started talking about it and started thinking about like the numbers on it. And for whatever reason, every otter card in this set, just except for Kitza, feels like it's just undertuned by like 1 mana or 1 point of stats or something. It just doesn't feel like... It felt like they were very conservative with almost every part of all of these otter cards except for Kitza.
It's interesting because the way they design some of... With this, and then there's the Otterball tactics that we mention in the peasant review, but like they intentionally designed cards that make otter tokens that are actually spells, so there's kind of like a tightness to like the constructed viability where all the things that are triggering prowess are also things that make more prowess creatures. So there's probably something there when you combine them all together, but then when you translate something like this to cube and you kind of lose that, like you're just ending up with what's probably just an understated creature, right?
Okay, so a 1/1 prowess creature token is only okay if you're playing like a prowess deck, which means you're playing an Izzet deck, like let's be honest. And then the level 2 for the amount of mana that you're investing, like I want to be getting back something bomby if I'm going to spend that much mana. Like I want to be getting back something that makes my opponents like shake in their boots that I'm getting it back, like a time warp or something like that. But like I can't picture the deck where I'm playing like an instant or sorcery that's worth 4 mana at instant speed to recur to my hand that also wants to be playing 1/1 prowess creature tokens. I think in order for a card like this to be good, like at the same mana cost, like the level 2 should have been like 4 mana, exile an instant or sorcery card with mana value 2 or less from your graveyard. You may cast it without paying its mana cost this turn or something. Like 4 mana to like flashback your bolt and cast it or something. That feels like it plays well with the 1/1 prowess creature token, but this just feels really disjointed.
Yeah, I think they could have shaved a mana off of both of the levels, and this would still be kind of sketchy.
I mean, wouldn't we be better off just playing like Pinnacle Monk? The 5 mana 2/2 prowess, get a spell back, but it's also an MDFC. Like that's kind of what this is. I mean, this spots you the 1 drop.
You're only saving 1 mana off of Pinnacle Monk, which isn't completely insignificant, but you also can play Pinnacle Monk as a land, so
I think we can all agree and move on that this just isn't it for Cube, but like there's probably some constructed viability here. Kidnap, final blue card. Chris, what are you thinking with Kidnap here?
So the reason I threw it up here is we don't have a whole lot of control magics on Arena. So if you have an Arena via like legal cube for digital play and you want a control magic style card, this does exist. I'm sure you guys probably agree with me. I don't personally like control magics because they are very variably powerful depending on what your opponent is doing. If you're playing against like a white shitter's token deck, this control magics aren't good. If you're playing against like a green, like spend the first 2 turns ramping up to a big thing, then it's really backbreaking. And if you're playing an Eternal Cube and you don't mind playing control magic, you're just going to play control magic and bribery and cards like that that are just infinitely better than this. I just wanted to toss this out there because it's an option if you want it for Arena.
Did you want to read the card?
Oh shit, yeah, no, I probably should, huh? So Kidnap 2 blue. It's an enchantment, gift a card, enchant creature. When Kidnap enters, you tap enchanted creature. If the gift wasn't promised, you put 3 stun counters on it. So if you don't gift a card, the creature that you steal is effectively out of commission for, 4 turns, more or less?
Pretty much, yeah.
And that is basically 4 mana Doomblade, depending on how fast the game goes. And then it's control magic, but your opponent gets a card if you don't do that. But you tap the creature, so you can't even like steal a creature and then have it up for defense. So I'm not crazy about this one. I wonder if the 5-cost one from Kaladesh is just better.
The Confiscation Coup?
Confiscation Coup. Yeah, Confiscation Coup costs 5. You generate 4 energy. So in like a cube vacuum, when you're not doing energy, that's the amount of energy that you get. And then you can steal a creature or artifact with mana value less than or equal to the amount of energy that you spend. So it's like a 5-cost control magic that can only get 4 drops and below, but I don't think it taps them, and it sure as hell doesn't put stun counters on them. That might just be better.
I missed when we first read this card that it taps it even if you pay the gift. I thought that it tapped and put 3 stun counters on it, and if you gifted a card, that didn't happen, which had me a little more excited about it. It's not still something that I would be interested in, but knowing that it taps down your creature the turn you cast this is just not competitive. Especially if you're not on Arena. On Arena, maybe it's still just one of the better effects you can get, but that's really sketchy to spend 4 mana and we don't get a blocker out of the deal until next turn.
Yeah, well, like I said, if you're playing Eternal and you like control magics, you have much better control magics. If you're playing an Arena Cube and you're a fan of control magics and you want another one, this exists.
Yeah. Not much to add to that one, but we can move into black here, and black actually has probably the lion's share of like excellent cards from this set, which I feel like I say every set, but we have kicking off Rotten Mouth Viper. This is 5 and a black for a mythic rare 6/6 elemental snake. As an additional cost to cast this spell, you may sacrifice any number of non-land permanents, and it costs 1 less to cast for each permanent sacrificed this way. When it enters or attacks, put a blight counter on it. Then, for each blight counter on it, each opponent loses 4 life unless that player sacrifices a non-land permanent or discards a card. So kind of like, what's that card called? Torment of Venom or whatever. Just to break this card down a little bit, it is 6 mana 6/6, but you're often probably paying like 3 to 4 mana for it if you can sacrifice things like treasure, food. I think we talked about it a little bit, and like what you're probably not supposed to do is just like sack your entire board of creatures to get this down for like 1 or 2 mana, but it is an option. Point being, this shouldn't cost a full 6 mana basically ever. And then notable about the trigger is it triggers right away. It gets a blight counter right away, so your opponent sacrifices something. They do have the buyout of sacrificing tokens of their own, like food and treasure that they have lying around, or little shitter, token creatures, 1/1s and stuff like that. But I think that's fair because this adds up so quickly. It compiles every turn. So it enters, it triggers once. When it attacks for the first time, it gets another blight counter, and then it triggers for each blight counter on it. So by the time this is attacked 1 time, you have essentially posed this dilemma to your opponent 3 times. If they couldn't sacrifice tokens to this card would be brutal. Like, they would just immediately probably die after that first attack. And then if this ever gets to attack a second time, you're talking about your opponent facing that decision 6 times. Like, that just adds up so quickly that this kind of had to give them the buyout of sacrificing tokens of their own. Otherwise, I think it would be a little bit too good. That said, it's an interesting card to talk about, but it's really weird to consider where it would slot into like a cube like ours, because we're not really like explicitly supporting food synergy, treasure synergy, anything like that. We will occasionally be able to cast this for 3 to 4 mana, but I don't know. I'm curious what you guys' take is on it now that we've talked about it a little bit behind the curtain. Like, it's obviously not like, oh, does this replace Grave Titan, because it's not really a 6-drop, so there's questions about how effective it would be. There's questions about where it would go in a curve, what kind of decks would use it best. What do you guys think of the Rotten Mouth Viper?
Okay, I just want to I just want to throw something by you guys. So turn 1, you cast Bloodsoaked Champion or a Voldaren Epicure, right? Turn 2, you cast a Blood Tithe Harvester. Turn 3, you play an Arena of Glory. And then you exert your arena, sack all your tokens, and make your opponent sacrifice 3 permanents on turn 3.
Yeah, if you can haste this card up, it is probably insane, because that's just 3 triggers right away, and they're getting hit by a 6/6.
Well, that's obviously insane, but also don't forget that they can choose to lose life or like discard like an.
True.
They can take 20. That is a viable option.
No, I'm saying like they can just like discard it. I know I said this about a card earlier, but I think the fact that this says each opponent is important, because in a heads-up game, like, you're sacrificing material directly that impacts like the head-to-head dynamic of what is going on with your opponent, and then the trigger affects one person, so it gets 1 resource. And you guys are correct. If you get to attack with this, if this lives, then it's going to get out of hand really, really quick. But I think like in a game of Commander, where more cards generate more random bullshit that's like lying around, like tokens, clues, yada, 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 the cost of sacrificing your own things relative to everything that's going on a 4-player board is significantly less brutal for you. And then it's snagging significantly more resources and threatening more life totals, creature piles, whatever at the same time. So
Chris just sees the word each on a card, each player.
I was going to say, I think you're getting caught up a bit too much.
I honestly think that that's why this is on here, because I think Heads Up Magic for me, this is, if it sticks, there's a good chance you're going to win, but like the cost of accelerating it out is so incredibly risky.
I agree, but I think this is like the Aquazot's conversation we had when that card came out, is that you're reading, I think you're reading the word each and being like, oh, this was designed Commander forward, and I think what happened is that this was just designed as a constructed card, and they're like, okay, we'll change like target opponent to each opponent and make it work in Commander. So I think it scales to Commander well, but I think this is a perfectly viable constructed plan.
I am not going to say that this card is going to be really powerful, but there's a dream here, and we also, I think, Chris, we're falling into the assumption that your opponent just always has the Doomblade, and we have seen that is not always the case, right? You don't always have the removal spell.
Well, this doesn't die to Doomblade, so.
No, sure, but your opponent's not always going to have the removal spell, especially if you're playing a more grindy deck. And while I don't think this is great in our main environment, if you're playing an environment that has a lot of game objects floating around where you're making things like food or map tokens that kind of are low value anyways, I think this card is quite good, especially if you've got ways to enable it with haste and things like that. But you attack with this card twice and you win the game, right? Like, I mean, your opponent, like, you're just not going to be able to sacrifice or pay that much life. That's 5 triggers, 6 triggers with the ETB. You know, and obviously you have to survive a couple of turns, but that does happen in Magic. Like, you do have creatures survive.
Okay, let me reframe. I'm not saying that this card is like hot dog shit. What I'm saying is, like, in the type of environment where we're typically evaluating cards for, which is like a high power, relatively straightforward cube, this is a risky Baneslayer. So I think I would rather put like a really powerful 3-drop in my deck that does the same thing every time and demands an answer than I would ever put like this in my deck.
Well, this does demand an answer. You have to use a removal spell on this.
No. I understand that. I understand that. But what I'm saying is, like, I would rather play like a lower risk, lower reward, more consistent card in my deck. Now, that being said, like, Teld and I are talking about potentially designing like a synergy power cube that's more based around like themes and has more of a build around-y type quality, and we've been talking about like green-black food, and I think if we were to do like a green-black food deck, then all of a sudden this gets like really interesting.
I think that's what this card secretly is in the context of the set too.
Yeah, so like let me reframe everything. I think this card is context dependent. In a cube where I want my cards to do what they do, I don't think I'm interested in this.
Okay, I think that's fair. I'm not even sure where it lands. I do think the text box is just an interesting thing to talk about for sure, though.
It is.
We,
It's cool
we have
design.
a couple. We actually have just like banger after banger here to talk about in black. Next up is Dark Star Augur, 2 and a black for a 2/3 rare bat warlock. It has offspring for black. It has flying, and it says at the beginning of your upkeep, reveal the top card of your library, put it into your hand, lose life equal to its mana value. So Flying Bob for 3 with offspring for black. Kind of hard to say anything bad about this that you wouldn't already say about like a Dark Confidant creature, you know, the riskiness of it or whatever, but you don't even have to offspring this. You could just 3 mana, 2/3 fly and draw an extra card every turn, lose some life.
I think a 2/3 flyer is a little understated, but I mean, the upside of being able to offspring it and the fact that your opponent kind of is opted into either killing it or putting your life total under enough pressure that it kills you is something.
I think this card's better than Bob. It's not fair to compare them directly because they're not the same mana cost. But the thing about Bob is that a 2/1 for 2 is a stat line that even on curve, there are going to be shitloads of games where it literally does not get into combat a single time, which basically makes it like a 2 mana enchantment that does that, but also can be easily removed. But I mean, for 1 more mana, you get evasion, so it can actually contribute to damage. You get 3 toughness, so it can actually block stuff. You get this offspring opportunity. The thing that I like about the offspring is, and don't get me wrong, if you're playing like a deck with a lot of mid-cost stuff in it, the offspring mode is going to kill you really fast. But what you can do if you're playing like a sacrificey deck is you can offspring this, draw 2 cards on your next turn, take the damage, like swing for 3 damage, and then just like feed the token to like a Yawgmoth or some other sacrifice outlet to trigger your Blood Artists, and you got like for 1 mana you got like a card, a damage, and then whatever your sacrifice effect was out of the deal, so you don't keep it on board and have it just mulch up your life total. I think we are going to see people put this in decks that are playing like 5 4-drops, and I think that's a really bad idea. Once you factor in lands, I probably want like the average mana cost in my deck, including lands, to be like 1.5. You know, I don't think I want to be taking more than 2 damage off of this like each turn. But yeah, and the other thing that we all know is these draw effects are really, really potent in like black sacrifice decks, where a lot of the stuff that you want to have on board are cheap cards that do engine effects that, you know, piece together a machine that tears your opponent apart. Like digging extra cards every turn to find your Blood Artist or your sacrifice outlet or whatever you need to get your machine running. That's just a great effect. I think this is a disgusting black aggro card.
Skill testing card too, I think. It's going to reward people who build decks appropriately with an effect like this, and it's going to reward people for knowing when you should not offspring it, because it is not objectively correct to offspring it, even if you're just lighting that extra black mana on fire instead. And one of the things I like about it is the dynamic where sometimes from the opposite side of the field, if you feel like you have enough control over the game, you could like choose not to interact with this and its offspring to try and like combat your opponent and have them kill themselves, which is a thing that is going to vary depending on how your opponent has built their deck. Because you're right, people do play Bob. I see vintage cube decks where people throw Bob in decks and they're just like, it'll work out. I won't hit my 2 7-drops that I'm trying to reanimate or whatever, and then like sometimes you die to it. So yeah. I like the dynamics of this card. It's really strong, and it's got some skill testing patterns to it.
Yeah, I do think if the default mode of this card is not playing this as a 4-drop, I think it's going to be a lot less good than we're kind of speculating. I think the biggest advantage this has over something like Bob or even Caustic Rocco is it's resilient to a single removal spell. Obviously, that's not going to be every case. We've already listed out all the spots where you don't want to offspring, but I do think you're probably putting this in your deck with the intent of offspringing it, if I'm guessing.
Yeah. I think you default to offspring and when you can, if you've built your deck appropriately, and then like given the situation and the dynamic of the game, the matchup, like you may choose not to offspring it, depending on what's going on. We all agree. It's an awesome card. Next one. Talk to me about this one real quick. Iridescent Vine Lasher.
Yeah, so we're going to talk some more about babies. Iridescent Vine Lasher is a single black mana for a 1/2 for a lizard assassin. It has offspring 2 and landfall. Deal 1 damage to any opponent. So that'll happen when a land enters play. So you play this on 1, right? It's a totally fine 1-drop. You can attack while the ground is open. And then as you play the game, it'll do an additional, if we assume we're going to make like 5 land drops in a game or 6 land drops in a game, that's an extra 5 damage if your opponent doesn't kill it. If you draw it a little later into the game at 3 mana, you're talking about a very real threat. So even if we assume that 5 to 6 mana, we played this on turn 3, it wasn't the biggest impact on our turn, or maybe we played on turn 4 so we can immediately make our land drop. However you want to do it, you're still talking about an extra 4 or 6 damage over the course of a game. If the game goes really long, this is a threat your opponent has to answer that never has to engage in combat but guarantees steady damage. This one is, we've been getting a lot of good black 1-drops, and I think this one is going to be particularly good. Maybe I'm just theory crafting a little too hard on it, but it just feels like the kind of card that is going to be super obnoxious in your aggressive sack decks and things like that, where this card just, you're going to want to not kill it, but also you need to kill it.
Yeah, I agree. It's nice in the sack decks too, because even though like the body is not particularly strong, like black 1-drop bodies don't tend to be particularly strong. And what you get for like your 2/1 on like your Bloodsoaked Champion or whatever is that it's recurable. This obviously has less aggressive power, but you're never going to hit a point in the game where like it's completely blanked, right? Drawing a land later in your aggressive deck is like never a fun draw, but you get a little value out of that with this. And the fact that it makes 2 bodies plays well with things that sacrifice, it sets up like Blood Artists for when you're ready to finish the game. And I actually think that the effect works great in tandem with Blood Artists, because if your plan is to kill your opponent with reach, chipping away at their life total with creature deaths and things like that, the chip from the landfalls that you're going to get is actually going to contribute overall to that plan, even though it's triggering off of a different axis.
Also, I forgot to mention fetch lands.
Yeah, fetch lands. Like if you're in a 2-color like sacrifice or aggressive deck and you draw your fetch late, it's just like, okay, I play land and do 2 damage. If you have the copy of it out, it deals 4, which is crazy.
Yeah, I mean, type of card that even if you're in mono black, you'll just start taking fetch lands for on color black fetch lands just for the purpose of this card. Not much to add to it. It is like my least favorite kind of card to play against, where like you're just scrambling to stabilize against like black aggro or black sacrifice, and like you end up in this position where you're at 3 life and your opponent's draws, like whether they hit a land or a non-land, are probably bad for you. So it's just kind of like one of those cards, but I do expect this card to perform quite well. And I think the default on this one, I don't know if you guys agree or not, I think the default on this one is you want to offspring it, but you will cast it for 1 if you like have nothing else to do on 1.
Yeah, I mean, if you draw this on turn 1 and you don't have anything else to cast, you're just running it out.
Yeah.
Yep.
Chris, do you want to talk about Osteomancer Adept? This is an interesting little dude.
Yeah, this is cool. It's a squirrel warlock. Kind of creepy art, actually. It's going to make me suspicious of the squirrels that I see in the park later. Like, what are you hiding in that? What are you hiding in that tree as a bone?
Yeah, they're like necromancers on Bloomburrow. It's kind of cool.
Oh, God, yeah. Creepy. But anyway, Osteomancer Adept is 1 and a black for a 2/2 with Death Touch. And you can tap it, and then till end of turn, you may cast creature spells from your graveyard by foraging in addition to paying their other costs. Foraging, once again, is you either sacrifice some food or exile 3 cards from your graveyard. In the context of most cubes, it's going to be the exiling cards from your graveyard. And if you cast a creature spell this way, the creature enters with a finality counter on it. So this doesn't really strike me as a particularly effective like black aggro card. I think where you really want this is like your green-black or red-black or Jund like rock decks that are playing like hand disruption and cheap removal and good solid finishing creatures. And you can just turn like your early game like Thoughtseizes, Inquisitions, Bolts, things like that into just reanimating your 4-drop. And notably, it doesn't add anything to the mana cost or anything of that nature. Like, it doesn't make it more expensive to do that. So if you have the resources to spend, you can just get back your Questing Beast or your Breaches, or in the later game, your Grave Titan or whatever else. And in those rocky decks, if you're under a lot of pressure, it'll trade for a 3-drop if you just need it to play defense. In terms of like the all-time pantheon of black 2s, I'm not going to comment on that for like Eternal, but for fair cubes like ours, I think this is a really sweet design and a potentially really solid value engine.
I do think my one real concern with this card is between this and Croxa and all the other cards that exist that either hate on the graveyard or use the graveyard, I do think there's a risk of just not wanting to put this card in your deck because you already have 2 or 3 other cards that utilize your graveyard, and the tax of it can be too high because we don't really have a lot of ways to make food in this environment. That being said, I mean, it's still a 2/2 Death Toucher, which is a totally reasonable body. And I think the ceiling is definitely there on this card. You know, it'll be a good value engine, but I would expect that if you play this, you're going to get to trigger it maybe once or twice if you draw it late game.
I mean, Emperor of Bones could just be better. I do like that you get to keep the creature that you reanimate. I'm not really sure. We've kind of been on the warpath, just like cutting the Modern Horizons cards that aren't uncommons. So I don't know. I agree with you, Teld. I think what we've found is like typically, at least in a cube like ours, that's not like turbo filling the graveyard, that like having more than two cards in your deck that care about utilizing your graveyard resources can be a little sketchy. And once you get up to three, you run the risk of like invalidating one of them completely because you're using the graveyard for the other. So we'll have to see.
Does play well with Malevolent Rumble, though.
Plays well with Gilded Goose, all I'm going to say.
True.
Well, it's funny because we're going to cut it in this update. But
all right, we'll
anyway,
talk about it.
We'll
Let's talk
discuss
about
it.
a different bird. Next up, we have Maha, Its Feathers Knight. 3 black for a 6/5 mythic rare elemental bird. It has flying, trample, ward, discard a card, and creatures your opponents control have base toughness 1, which is an ability that you can basically read as like all of your creatures have death touch, but it also means that your toughness-based removal, like your disfigures and your shocks and all red burn spells, now kill any creature they're targeted at. But giant flyer with a little bit of protection and an ability that makes your creatures win in combat.
Good, but very boring.
Yeah, weird design.
If you're playing like Fear Fire Foes or Meat Hook, obviously it pairs really, really well with those
Toxic.
set of cards. Yeah, Toxic Deluge.
Even Languish, like this just makes Languish clean everything up, and it survives Languish. It's a weird effect to staple to this card. One thing I did want to mention is for a really long time there was like a running joke in the Cube community that black 5s were just like not worth playing. And I remember this because when they spoiled Doom Whisperer, like there were corners of the community that like freaked out, like look at how massive this thing is, and their survivability. I mean, granted, like some people were talking about the survivability in environments where their decks had Reanimator or whatever, but like a 6/6 Flample for 5 that can just die a Doomblade and then you can get card selection off of it, but it actually costs a really significant amount of life if you're not careful. It just ended up not being that good. And the reason that I want to bring this up is like this is technically smaller statted, but like does it really matter that your Flampler has like 6 toughness instead of 5? Like not really in most scenarios. But ward discard a card, that's a real cost. Your opponent's not removing this without 2-for-1ing themselves. So if you're looking for like a big like mid-range black finisher, I think this is a viable option. I do think Aquazotz is better, which is what we're playing.
Aquazotz is better than a lot of cards, but I do agree with you.
Yeah. Can we go back to the review where I was like, I hope this is good enough, but I don't think that it is. Turns out it was.
Yeah, we've had our stint with black 5 drops, and I think we finally landed on Aquazotz being a good one. But we went through a lot of them. I remember the Junji days.
I do remember because Theo just never stopped giving me shit about it. Yeah.
Yeah. Chris, I know you're going to get this art somewhere. I don't know what room in your living situation you still have to put like Magic the Gathering art on, since you're just like piling all the Bloomburrow art on, but I'm sure this art goes somewhere on the wall, right?
Let's just say that it will be the room that most people are not privileged to visit. That's all I'm going to say about that. I actually want Teld to talk about this card because he sort of pointed out to me how good this potentially is.
Sure. So we're talking about Season of Loss. So it is 3 black for a mythic sorcery. You choose up to 5 paw prints worth of modes. You can choose the same mode more than once. The 1 mode is each player sacrifices a creature. The 2 mode is draw a card for each creature you controlled that died this turn. And the 3 mode is each opponent loses X life, where X is the number of creature cards in your graveyard. So I think the baseline mode of this card, when we're talking about what you want to do with this card, is either your opponent has a modestly wide board of 4 or 5 creatures, you just play this, it's a Wrath, fine enough, right? But then if your opponent has a smaller board, because a lot of our decks these days are playing a fewer number of larger creatures. So if you're in a spot where you contained the board, they've got 3 creatures in play and maybe you've got 1 or 2, you can play this for 3 in the 2 mode, and then you sacrifice your 2 random creatures, your opponent sacrifices their board, you've wrath them, and then you get to draw 2 cards. And then it has a number of modes beyond that. So, I mean, the 3 mode, I think you're only going to use if you're in a spot where you can really kill your opponent. But it does synergize with the 1 paw mode where you can sacrifice 2 of your creatures and then the 3rd step resolves. And you get to do 2 extra damage if you sacrifice 2 creatures there. I could even see the spot where you both players sacrifice a creature, and then I'm going to draw 2 cards for each creature that died this turn. Maybe if we flunge, right, and we trade off boards, and then we don't have a lot of resources left, we get to draw a bunch of cards. So I think this card's like base mode is either going to be a Wrath for a mid-size board, or a Wrath for a smaller board that puts you up on some cards. And then it has a wide range of modes from there that lead to like drawing a bunch of cards, to dealing a bunch of damage and sacrificing some things. So I think altogether there's a wide range of modes, but it kind of revolves around making each player innocent blooding each player a number of times.
Yeah, 5-mana Wrath, not fabulous, but it's definitely something that you will play. I think the best home for this card is in like a black sacrifice deck where everybody sacrifices 5 creatures as like the emergency holy shit I'm behind mode. But what you're mostly trying to do with the card is to have like an artist on board and maybe like one other valuable creature. Or maybe it's just like literally you have like an artist and like 3 pieces of crap on board that you want to trigger the artist with. Your opponent has like 3 creatures, and you basically Wrath in such a way that you keep the most important piece of your board, and then you also like draw a million cards. Like if you sack 3 creatures and keep your Blood Artist, they sack 3 creatures, and then you draw 3 cards. Like that's kind of insane. I don't know if I want to put this in my like raw control deck, but if you're really desperate for a Wrath, you could.
Yeah, I think my one concern about this card is something we mentioned earlier with Starfall Invocation, where I do think this is a card that is probably at its best, like you mentioned, in decks that are kind of creature decks, where it's sort of a Wrath that also works its way into your creature deck, which could be a little concerning. But I think the design here is super interesting, and I think it's just way more interesting than the other cards. So I think that's part of why we're talking about it.
Agreed. Yeah, I would say in response to that, like I agree with you, that's a concern. Black already kind of has a dynamic like that with Meat Hook Massacre, though.
Our black sweepers have had a little bit of a facelift this year. Final card in black that just wanted to mention real quick was Fell, 1 in a black for a sorcery. It's an uncommon, destroy target creature, and I don't know where this is in the Doomblade pantheon. It's probably worse than majority of the instant speed effects, but it's such a clean text box that it has great art. Felt like we should mention this just as a good little removal spell. In fact, if you're trying to like maybe downgrade your black removal, if that's like a concern of yours, people complaining that the removal's too good, like this might actually be an option to swap out like a regular Doomblade type effect for this.
Yeah, I think it not being an instant, at least for like hyper powerful environments, doesn't justify the lack of a condition. Like I'll happily pay 2 life to have my Doomblade be instant speed, right? Because like there's a lot of times in an aggressive deck where you have a Doomblade and a creature in your hand, but there's like not anything like decent to Doomblade. So what you want to do is play out your 2-drop and then like Doomblade whatever your opponent's best play is like the next turn. And this is going to lead to situations occasionally where you have to like sacrifice 2 mana worth of tempo, which is just not that great. Also, the condition with a lot of these Doomblades tends to be some kind of life loss, and aggressive decks care about this less. But I mean, I wish that this art was on an instant speed Doomblade effect with a condition, because even if it was worse than one of the Doomblades we were playing, I'd be advocating to play it just because it looks so sweet.
I wish the rules text was centered on this card. I feel like that would like add to the aesthetic quite a bit.
I was actually just thinking the same thing. Yeah, it needed to be center text instead of left centered.
Yeah, that's it for black, though. Quite a few awesome things coming in for black. We're going to move into red, and which one of you wants to talk about the Hired Claw here? Because I'll say, just like right off the bat, I'm not as excited about this card as it seems like the community is, and maybe I'm the one underrating it here.
Yeah, sure. So we're talking about Hired Claw, which is a single red mana for a lizard mercenary at rare. It's a 1/2, and when you attack with 1 or more lizards, Hired Claw deals 1 damage to target opponent, and you can pay 1 in a red to put a +1/+1 counter on Hired Claw. Activate only if your opponent has lost life this turn and only once each turn, which it will be able to do if it's attacking, right? So, I mean, I don't think this is the best 1-drop of all time or anything like that, but I do think this is a pretty solid 1-drop that seems like it'll be really good early into the game, where you'll be able to guarantee some damage onto your opponent and then threaten to pump it at a time in the game where your opponent's going to be maybe hesitant to block your creature. And then as your mana opens up and you start running out of cards, that becomes just something you can do. And our red decks at the moment are getting pretty good at keeping the board clear for several turns. So I could see stuff where you want to spend your mana on this to make it a little bit bigger so that you can set up future attacks on future turns. Again, not like a world beater or anything, but I do think this is a solid 1-drop with decent damage and some scaling. I'm sure in some areas the lizard text will matter. I don't think it will in our environment, but definitely in the limited environment, this is going to be even better because you won't have to attack with it if it's not optimal to do so.
You know, I understand why I'm lower on this card, and maybe I shouldn't be. It has the same quality that I underrated with Ranger class when that card first came out, and that's that if people are going all in on this and actually spending their mana on this to pump it, like, I think they're just doing it wrong. Like, unless you have literally nothing else to do. But it's the threat of activate. Like, I think what you're supposed to do with this card, attack with it, get the 1 damage in, opponent can't profitably block early on, and then you just don't pump it. You get an extra point of damage. You do something else with your mana. So, like, what I see is people doing the thing where they're just, like, starting to dump mana into this on turn 2 and turn 3 and stuff like that. And just, like, yeah, they're getting an extra damage, but they're burning so much mana that they should be using to, like, develop their board and stuff like that. And that's why I'm, like, thinking, oh, maybe this card's not as good. But I think as a threat of activation card, yeah, actually, this should be good. Worth noting, too, that you can activate the ability of your opponent somehow loses life on their turn, and you just have 2 mana floating around as well.
Oh, shit. Yeah, I bet that's going to come up. I hadn't even considered that. Yeah, Tim, this is definitely a threat of activation card. Like, on turn 1, if you attack and your opponent doesn't block it because of threat of activation, and you do 2 damage, and you have, like, Karisev in hand, you're just supposed to play Karisev.
Yeah.
But the other thing that I like about this card is on the back end, on the later half of the game, if I draw this as a 1-drop, and it's just like I get to play my 1-drop for turn, great. When I attack the next turn, I'm probably, later in the game, not going to draw... My next card probably isn't going to eat all of my mana. So in the later game, you're drawing a 1-drop, but you're essentially drawing like a 2/3 that deals a damage on attack, which is better than drawing a different 1-drop. If I'm making any sense, right? Because that tempo
yeah. Because you can even not even the next turn, but that same turn, if you just have 3 mana and this is your draw and you deal damage, you can just play and pump it during the same turn, right?
That's also true, and I tend to like mana sinks in red aggressive cards more than in other cards because red just has such a tendency to like shit out its hand, and then you just want anywhere to put your mana, even if it's inefficient, to continue pressing your game plan, and Hired Claw gives you the opportunity to do that.
Yeah, our red 1-drops could use a good aggro card, so I think I'm coming around to this one. The next one's one of the big question marks I mentioned at the top of the episode. And Chris, I really want your opinion on this because Teld and I have talked about it already. And just to frame kind of the question I'm asking you is maybe it's like some cognitive dissonance with the red creatures here or something. But I personally think a Magda is a good card. Magda, Brazen Outlaw, the 2-mana 2/1. When it becomes tapped, make a treasure. And this card like feels at least comparable to Magda. But I don't like this card, and I'm like, well, I'm wondering if you can point out what it is about this card that I don't like. So just to read the card, this is Brazen Collector, 1 in a red, 2/1, uncommon first striker. When it attacks, make a red mana, and you don't lose that mana until the end of the turn. And very, very similar to a Magda with first strike as far as like 2-mana 2/1 that gives you red mana when it attacks, or gives you a mana when it attacks. And I don't know what it is. Maybe it's just because the card is like reads as boring to me. Maybe it's just like, I don't know, it's not flashy, but yeah, I don't like this card and I'm not sure why I don't.
So, okay, just to reference back to Magda, one of the things that we cut Magda for was it was just a very feast or famine card. Magda felt like if I play it on turn 2 on the play as a red aggressive deck, and then like I follow that up with like something that can get your creature out of the way and make a treasure, then I'm just kind of like off to the races, right? Like if I can accelerate out like a Chandra or a Rekindling Phoenix or something in my red deck, which I'm not supposed to be able to do, that's really punishing. That was also at a time where red aggro was doing better than it had up until recently been doing. So we didn't like the snowballing nature of the card, but the other thing that we didn't like about the card was on the draw, it's just like hot shit, because a 2/1 for 2 is just like a meaningless body. And unless you're playing in a cube that's very treasure generation focused, the dragon text like doesn't matter. I think 2 things are different about this card, A, in terms of the card, and B, in terms of the context. The stabilizing mid-cost stuff in Magic in general, at least on Arena, has become so much better that I'm more comfortable with the idea that red kind of needs to snowball in order to win games. Like, aggro snowballs are bothering me less because it feels like aggro snowballing is kind of what aggro needs to do to win. And the other thing is, like, the difference between having first strike and not having first strike on a 2-power creature is so fucking massive. Like, if I'm on the draw and I play this, it just blocks anything that has 2 toughness. It doesn't have can't block, it doesn't come in tapped. First strike on attacks combines really, really well with instant speed burn. I think the first strike on this card versus Magda is just like everything.
I think this card is better than Magda in most gameplay scenarios for a regular cube, because you really never sandbag the mana for Magda. Occasionally it comes up, but very rarely. Usually you're just accelerating towards a 4-drop. First Strike obviously makes this card better, but if you draw this card after turn 2, it still has the problem of being kind of anemic. I think it's okay. I'm down to try it and see, because it's got some good snowball-y starts. But I would temper my expectations here a little bit, because while this, I think, has more board impact than Magda, I don't think it's going to be much better than Magda for much longer. You know, you've got a lot of 3 toughness creatures where you're going to need to pump this or get some burn. Obviously, cards like Inti can do that. And if you do that, it's going to be good. I kind of feel what Tim's saying, though, where I see this card, I recognize that it's probably just better than Magda. But I don't think Magda is a very good card, so I'm a little hesitant, but I think it'll be better here than I actually think it would be in the Peasant Cube. We actually agreed Peasant is probably so synergy focused that a card like this is substantially less interesting. Whereas in the main cube, I think if you're playing a red aggressive deck, especially if you're playing Hazoret, I guess this is actually not very good with Hazoret specifically, but you're playing Chandra, maybe it would be a better example, or some of the other like 4-drops. I think that's actually the other thing too, and maybe this isn't a big deal, but you're ramping into a color where most of the expensive cards have haste, so there are spots where the ramp isn't going to be super helpful, but obviously Magda suffers from that same spot.
Yeah, I think you really want to play this on curve if you're in a red aggressive deck. I think it retains value if you don't play it on curve, like especially in like a Gruul deck where there's more mana to spend. Also, if you have a card like Inti in your deck, or
Bristly Bill, Ordinary Tumblewag, Luminarch Veteran, or Aspirant.
Well,
Innkeeper's Talent.
Yeah, stuff that makes stuff bigger, obviously. But what I was referring to is like if you have red cards that help you filter your draws, then you're gonna create, and you're playing a low land count because you want to be aggressive, you want to be low to the ground. Maybe you hit your 3rd land drop, but you don't hit your 4th for like a while because you went low on lands. I think that there's a potential for the mana generation to stay relevant into the mid game, depending on your deck scenario, whether it's filtration or advantage, or you're playing this as a 2-drop in a deck that is playing a number of more expensive cards that are maybe non-red. I expect it to be solid. I don't think this is like the greatest world beater red 2-drop of all time, but I think the first strike on it is like a really big game. If it didn't have first strike, obviously we wouldn't be discussing it at all.
Maybe we're all evaluating it like roughly the same, but it's a matter of like the 2-drops that are surrounding it, or like when you put it next to Inti, it's like you know. Right. So maybe it's just like not fair for me to think about it the way I'm thinking about it. But that was an interesting one that came up in the Peasant review. I would like to talk about this next one here. Emberheart Challenger, 1 in a red for a 2/2 haste prowess. And Valiant. I think this is the only instance of Valiant we're talking about here. When it becomes the target of a spell or ability you control for the first time each turn, exile the top card of your library. You may play that card until end of turn. It's just the turn that you trigger Valiant, so no carrying over to the next turn. I think, first off, erase Valiant for a second. 1 in a red, 2/2 haste prowess, I think gets there. We're currently on Fugitive Codebreaker. I should say gets there for our cube. I don't know if the Fugitive Codebreaker was a card that was really like breaking into Vintage Cube or anything like that. But Fugitive Codebreaker from Murders of Karlov Manor being a 2 mana 2/1 prowess haste with like a largely irrelevant ability that comes up like occasionally and is good. I think just adding the point of toughness already makes this, I think, better than Codebreaker most of the time. But also, Valiant, like we mentioned top of the episode, Valiant's not just flavor text. It's a little hard to, like, get this going with things like, oh, I have to, like the scenario where I have to target this somehow and I have to be able to cast and play the card that it exiles. Like, that's just not going to happen every time. But you will absolutely put Bone Splitter in a deck that has this card in it. Like, they just naturally go in the same deck. You have Monstrous Rage. You have, in green-red, your Bristly Bills, in white-red, your Luminarch Aspirant. Anything that can target this is essentially drawing you an extra card for the turn. And I think that's just a great ability to tack on to what I think is, I think if you erased a Valiant, 2 mana, 2/2 haste prowess, not the most exciting text box, but I think that would be good enough, especially given that we're already on Codebreaker.
Agreed. Also, like, we're not playing any variant of this card really right now, but like with something like Giver of Runes, you can just like give this protection from whatever you don't want to be able to block it, trigger it, draw a card. But yeah, I agree with you. Like, I've really come to feel that toughness is more important than power on a prowess creature in general. Because you want the prowess to be able to pump it up to a point where it can attack and it's not just going to get swallowed in combat. And if you're able to do that, you're going to get enough power on it for it to represent meaningful damage. Like, making a 2-1 into a 3-2 with prowess, I don't think is as good in a lot of scenarios as making a 1-2 into a 2-3. And with Fugitive Codebreaker, if you trigger prowess once, like, sure, it's got 3 power, but there's still like a number of 1-drop creatures that are just going to trade with it anyway.
Well, I mean, think about, we play Soulscar Mage, and that card holds up, and we poo-pooed the Otter Macon class, which makes a 1-1 prowess instead of a 1-2 prowess. Like, if the Otter class made a 1-2 prowess, we'd probably be talking about that card.
Yes. So I guess actually that focuses it better. I think what I should say is 1 prowess trigger getting your prowess creature up to 3 toughness is important. Mm-hmm. In my mind. It means it's not just going to trade for some like 1 mana stinker that just happens to be sitting on the battlefield. So that in and of itself, if you trade that off for the like disguise thing, which I have seen come up, but like not frequently. Yeah, I think if you're looking for a haste prowess creature, like a 2/2 stat line for 2 with both of those keywords is just solid. I mean, if you draw this on turn 4 and you're holding like a lightning strike to clear a blocker, like that's a lot of damage out of nowhere.
And I don't want to discount Codebreaker's like disguise ability, because it is a thing that you can do sometimes that could like actually decide a game. But I think Valiant on this will come up at a higher clip than the disguise text on Codebreaker. You
have to have things going really well for a Codebreaker to, or really poorly maybe, for a Codebreaker to ever flip. Because it's 3 mana plus it's like 6 or 7 to flip. And it gets cheaper for all the spells in your graveyard, but that's a minimum of 4 or 5 mana, and a lot of times your red decks aren't even hitting that many lands.
I have seen it happen, like Chris said, but it's not a consistent thing. It's not something you put the card in your deck to do, really, but if it comes up, it's nice. Whereas I think you could actually like maybe change a pick or two in your draft order to like actually make Valiant pop a little bit. And Teld, you mentioned the other Valiant creature, which we're not really going to talk about here, but Heartfire Hero, which we talked about for the Peasant Cube. That's another Valiant creature that maybe we should talk about a little bit behind the curtain, but we didn't really talk about it ahead of time. That said, this is just a solid little card on stats and keywords, so I'm excited by that one. Byway Barterer, which, excuse my language, but I've been referring to this as a fuck me eyes raccoon. 2 and a red for a 3/3. Rare record. He's so seductive.
You just know he's going to scratch your back up.
All right, so we've discovered what Tim's persona is.
Okay, Byway Barterer, 3 mana, 3/3 menace, rare raccoon rogue. Whenever you expend 4, you may discard your hand and draw 2 cards. And again, expend 4 means when you've spent your 4th mana on spells that turn, it doesn't count mana sinks and stuff like that. So spend 4 mana, you have the option to pitch your hand to draw 2 cards. It's a simple card. I'm not sure where you guys think it lands. It's got that same problem as like the Jackdaw Savior in white, where it's like, does this really compete with the other red 3s? And I think that's the thing that would knock it down, if anything. But the package here is nice.
Okay, I'm actually thinking out loud, or just like spitballing here. But how does this card compare to Seasoned Pyromancer, right? Because both of these cards, I think, are cards that you want to be dumping your hand out. I don't think generally with Seasoned Pyromancer you're looking to cycle cards unless you have to, at least in our environment. And so this doesn't guarantee any sort of draw. You have to have something to follow it up, and you have to play it on turn 4. But it has a better stat line, better keywords, doesn't give you graveyard value. So there's a little bit of push and pull there. But if you were going to insert this into our environment, that's the spot, right, for that sort of effect. And so I think you'd be comparing it to that card. I think Seasoned Pyromancer is certainly a more consistent card, but I can see this card taking that slot and being a card that potentially generates a lot of card advantage over a turn, right? Because you play this, you play your last card as like a 1 mana spell. You draw 2 cards. We're assuming you're out of cards or have 1 card left in your hand, right? You get another draw step your next turn. Now you got 3 cards to make the expend happen again. So, I mean, there's certainly potential there where you could, if you assume that you're going to have 3 cards at the start of every turn, that you could manage to do that. But then I would point you to the winning red aggressive decks that we see, and their mana curve is a generous term. Let me put it that way.
Yeah, I think this card is just like, I think if you can do the thing, and I didn't even consider this before Teld said it, but if you get it to trigger once and you draw 2 cards and then you draw again for your next turn, you're a lot more likely to be able to just consistently do that every turn. Even if the cards in your deck are cheap, but like, what if you top deck this when your average card costs like 1.75 or like somewhere between 1.75 and 2.25 mana? Like,
Well, that's where being a 3/3 menace probably saves it a little bit, because it's
Sure.
not an embarrassing creature, but like, yeah,
No.
you're not doing the thing, which is why it's in your deck, presumably.
I like Pyromancer better because sometimes you just draw a hand where like it's right to play Pyromancer on 3 because you overdrew on lands. Or let's say you're holding like a land and a 1-drop, and like the 1-drop is not really going to impact the board, so you discard the land and the 1-drop, and like you don't get like a 1-drop's worth of value out of discarding the 1-drop, but you do get a 1/1 token. You don't get nothing.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So like sometimes you're just going to discard something that's like not really useful on board, and like the 1/1 you get isn't phenomenal, but like at least you get something to like maybe trade off on blocks or something. And the activation on Pyromancer out of the graveyard is expensive, but I have lost to it, where
It
my
matters.
opponent just
It matters.
needed just like 2 more cheap little creatures on board, in their like tokensy deck for it to matter. You can discard the Pyromancer to put it in the graveyard to like another effect and then get that value later. I bang my drum about this constantly. I want my cube cards consistent, and if I think that this is not obviously better than Seasoned Pyromancer, then I don't know if I'm cutting like Breaches or Bone Crusher, or if we were still playing Fable, God no, you'd never cut Fable for this. So I just don't think it gets there. I think it's fine, but I don't think it gets there.
Sounds like we're all in agreement on that one. And same goes for the last red card here, which is like, I think this is an interesting one to talk about, even though I think we all landed on like, this card's not that good. Blooming Blast is 1 in a red for an uncommon instant. It has Gift a Treasure, and it says it deals 2 damage to target creature. If the gift was promised, it deals 3 damage to the creature's controller as well, which is a nice little effect. But I think what we recognize, or at least what leads me to believe this card's not that good outside of like constructed applications, is that 2 damage is obviously 2 damage to a creature. It doesn't even go to face or planeswalker or anything, but 2 damage to a creature is obviously at its best earlier in the game when Gift in a Treasure is at its worst, right? Mm-hmm. You don't want to accelerate your opponent to just deal a little bit of extra chunk damage to your opponent. But then the reverse is also true, where when the treasure is more like acceptable to give to your opponent later in the game, 2 damage is now at its worst. Maybe 3 damage to the creature's controller is better at that point, because like that's the reach you need to close out a game. So sometimes this can just kill your opponent out of nowhere. But as a removal spell, like an early game removal spell, a lot of times you're just going to be priced into casting it without the gift, in which case, like, why is this that exciting in the first place? You just play one of the other 2 mana shock variants with upside. I'm willing to bet like a Magma Jet is probably better than this consistently.
Yeah, I'll just say what I said in the Peasant review, that I think this card should have had the damage swapped, where it was 3 damage to a creature and then 2 extra if you paid the gift. That way you'd be able to kill a wider swath of creatures, but it wouldn't represent quite as much reach. I think the card would probably just play better there. And maybe it was in testing and that was too good because, at that point, I guess the gift is kind of free. You would just put a 2 mana deal 3 in your deck if you had the option to deal 2 extra. So I guess that's this card doing 2 naturally is kind of the buy-in cost of putting the card in your deck, which I think makes it bad, but still.
Even with the numbers being tuned what they are, they literally had space on the card for it to say creature or planeswalker, but it doesn't.
It's weird that it's not planeswalker. I wonder why that is.
Yeah, no, I was wondering the same thing, because they put creature or planeswalker on basically anything that they print these days, even if it's common. But yeah, this just didn't get there for us. I mean, who knows? Maybe it'll like show up in Constructed or something, and it'll just be sort of revealed that gifting a treasure to do 3 damage to face is something that Red wants to do. But the fact that the damage for the mana cost and the target limitations are such that they are, like, the non-gifted version of the card is just not something you would put in a contemporary cube. So,
all right, well, closing out Red on a little bit of a stinker there, but moving into green with an all-timer here. We've got Birds of Paradise coming to the client for the first time. Don't really need to go into detail about why Birds of Paradise is good, but if somehow you don't know what this card is, it's a green mana for a 0/1 bird with flying, and it taps for any color of mana. Maybe not actually the best mana dork of all time. at 1 mana anymore, but certainly in the conversation and great pickup.
Really good card. Not much to say.
Anything to add about birds?
No, I just think it's cool that we're getting 3 very classic cards, and then we're getting a 4th that we'll talk about a little bit later. It's just, this is one of those cards that, like, ever since we put together the list, like, years ago, I've wanted to see in the list. And
I do have one thing to say. When you have Nesto Angel sitting in play, this becomes ephemerate.
Okay. Thanks for your contribution to the podcast.
That's what I'm here for.
Chris, can you stay on the line with me after we close out? I gotta talk to you about something.
Okay.
Okay, this little dude here. So Paul Patch Recruit. Okay, I can't. Somebody read the card. I can't even read the name.
Paw Patch Recruit, and also I'm just gonna say that they didn't do a very good job of making this motherfucker look like a recruit. Like, he kind of looks like a knight. He's got plate armor and a massive flail. And battle colors. This guy looks like
bringing his kid to.
I know.
Probably not.
But Paw Pat would just put ER on there. This guy looks like a recruiter. This guy looks like the dude who shows up to the Warren and starts like squeaking really loud and waving around his gigantic 2-handed flail, and people are like, "Fuck yeah, let's go kill some lizards."
Maybe the Paw Patch are elites. You know, maybe that's the rabbit Navy SEALs equivalent.
Oh, okay. No, I can see that. Okay. Anyway, what the card does. Man, they didn't even make him a knight. They really fucked this guy over. All right, Paw Patch Recruit, 1 green for 2/1. So Teld's off Savannah Lions, but this one does a lot of stuff. Savannah Rabbits. 2/1 Rabbit Warrior. It has Offspring for 2 generic mana. It has Trample. And whenever a creature you control becomes the target of a spell or ability an opponent controls, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control other than that creature. So most green 1-drops that are not some form of accelerator or kindred thing have tended to be like Experiment 1 variants. And this is a green, aggressively slanted 1-drop that is doing something very unique relative to anything I think that we've seen before. So if you're the type of person who's like trying to push green aggro as a deck in your cube, I think that this is a fabulous get. Now the question for those of us that aren't, because we have black, white, and red traditional aggressive decks, I think the feeling among the designers is that like we don't need an aggro deck in every single color. The question is, if your green decks span the aggressively oriented mid-range to slower ramp kind of green spectrum, where does this fit in? And to be honest with you, I'm not 100% sure. I think you want to be offspringing this, is what you want to be doing, because if they target one, like if they target anything other than those 2 things, you get 2 +1/+1 counters. If you have 2 of them and one of them gets targeted, like they kill the original, you put the +1/+1 counter on the second one.
2 +1/+1 counters.
2 +1/+1 counters, right. But the interesting thing is, like, the bodies are not large enough that they're going to meaningfully attack in like a Gruul deck or something. So there's a lot of power on this card, but it's like kind of hard for me to parse what it's supposed to be doing if you're not playing like a green deck that wants to be playing an aggressive 1-drop on 1. So do you guys have any comments on that?
Yeah, so I played this in my pre-release deck yesterday, and what it functionally said was your opponent is not allowed to cast removal spells. And I don't know if that's going to be the case in Cube, but if you offspring this out, what ends up happening is your opponent can't kill this without giving you a 3/3, because your 1/1 becomes a 3/3, right? And you still have that effect going. And so all of your small creatures, if they target any other creature, like you play a big creature, all your small creatures get bigger. So it doesn't literally give that text, but it makes removal extremely awkward on your opponent's side of the board. And this becomes doubly true in a format that is becoming increasingly defined on the green section by Tyvar Stand, where you can not only get these effects, like you could Tyvar Stand, Repulsive Mutation. There's all these different effects now that are making removal into green decks much more difficult to profitably come up with the exchange. But yeah, if you look at this as like every time your opponent uses a removal spell, you get 2 +1/+1 counters on something. I mean, even your mana dorks are going to start becoming, because if you play this you play the mana dork on turn 1, this on turn 2, right? Suddenly you're in a spot where your opponent, if they didn't bolt the bird on turn 1, can't profitably do so without giving you just so much in the way of stats, because then you're going to have those 2 +1 counters to put on these cards. But then your opponent, if they try to deal with those down the road, you're going to keep making progressively bigger creatures. It makes the whole removal game extremely awkward for your opponent in terms of single target removal.
Yeah. I mean, the card reads generically good. I get what Chris is putting down as far as like where does it slot in, but I mean, I assume what you want to do is just go 2-drop whatever. Best case scenario, it's something like a Kyrian Beast Collar or the Sharp Eyed Rookie or something like that, and then play this on 3 and just be like, okay, like you can interact with my stuff, but you're gonna be taking more damage. So it's kind of got like Luminarch Aspirant vibes, what I like to call a reverse lightning rod. Where like the Paul Patch Recruit might not be the actual thing killing you, but by killing the other creatures, like the little utility guy is getting out of hand. So it's like damned if you do, damned if you don't, as far as which one you kill. But yeah, this is interesting. I also didn't really process the fact that it triggers on your opponent's abilities targeting your stuff too. So like something as simple as like a Skyclave Shade coming down and targeting one of your creatures will trigger this as well. Extra utility there that I didn't even recognize. But I mean, this just seems like a rock solid card, and whether or not like it supports or your green section supports it is the question. Like it's obviously there on power level, I think, but it's a question of like if this was the only green aggressive card in your section, like it probably wouldn't have much of a home. But it's kind of also like a tokens card, so it's always going to have a home in Selesnya. It just reads like a rock solid card. And we've added Pelt Collector and Werewolf Pack Leader, so we are supporting something of a green beatdown deck where this will certainly have a home.
Yeah, I mean, even if you play this card on turn 1 and you don't do the offspring, it still creates a similar. It's obviously a lot weaker if you don't get the 1/1 rider with it, but it still protects your future plays, your bristly bills and things, because your opponent's gonna have to put counters on this and use a removal spell on it later, anyways.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to blow through the next one real quick because I think it's a card that we should mention. It's Keen-Eyed Curator. It's green for a 3/3 rare Raccoon Scout. As long as there are 4 or more card types among cards exiled with Keen-Eyed Curator, it gets +4/+4 and has trample, and you can pay 1 generic mana to exile target card from a graveyard. I actually am personally turned off by this sort of graveyard hate because it's just generic exile whenever I need to, eat your graveyard. While cards like this exist on the battlefield, anyone who needs to use their graveyard to like participate in the game just cannot. So I'm not a huge fan of this in cubes like ours where you're not really like doing huge reanimator things and those decks need to be punished this hard. But I'm willing to bet there are cubes where this is the card you want over something like Scavenging Ooze. And like the Delirium text is a little bit distractive because it makes you think like, oh, how many different card types am I really going to have? But I don't think that's actually a huge part of the card. Like green 3/3 is good stats. This is good graveyard hate. If that's something you're interested in, I think this card absolutely gets there. And I mean, Scavenging Ooze I think does hold up. It's a little bit behind the times, but it holds up. And this is like an alternative option if like graveyard hate is something you really need or you're trying to bolster like specifically a green beatdown deck.
Yeah, good card. I mean, a reasonable enough card. I mean, it ends up kind of looking like 6 mana, 7/7 trample, but you get to break all that up. You're going to, if you play this and it sits in play for a couple of turns, you're going to hit it, right? Creature, land, instant sorcery is going to come up in most games. Even if it doesn't, the buy-in was relatively cheap and it's a graveyard hoser on top of that. So, like you said, I don't like this for our environment, but the power level on this card is definitely there if this is something you want to support.
Mm-hmm. 2-drop Mana Dork. Chris, do you want to take the Mana Dork here?
So yeah, this is Tender Wild Guide. It's 1 and a green for a 2/2. Possum Druid. We in North Carolina love our possums. And it has an offspring of God. They're such weird creatures. It has an offspring of 2 generic mana. It has tap, add 1 mana of any color, and it also has tap, put a +1/+1 counter on this creature. So this is kind of nutty. Like
sweet.
Even just the baseline is 2/2 that makes 1 mana of any color, which is not a card you play by itself. But also, like, one of the things that makes, like, Llanowar...
The Loam Speaker.
Loam Speaker or Armored Scrap Gorger so great is... What tends to happen with dorks is that dorks tend to be these tempo plays where the creature on the board doesn't really impact the board that much. Its purpose is to accelerate you. But then when you're done accelerating or you're not drawing into action, the advantage that they've provided you has essentially been used up, and they were sort of like, they're sort of card negative after a point in a way. And cards like this that, like, once you don't need the mana anymore, they just start growing into, like, credible threats. And if you offspring it, you've got 2 of them that are doing that. Yeah, this is just a great dork. So we recently got Fanatic of Ronus in Modern Horizons 3, and that was just so, like, abusively broken. It was just like, absolutely fuck no. This is really powerful for a 2-mana dork, but this is like the amount of power that like I'm willing to look at on a 2-mana dork. I think this is really good.
So it's a modal 2-mana mana dork that can also grow, but it also has the modality of kind of being, if you squint, an explosive vegetation that produces 2 threats as well. So I think the overall package on this card is really, really good, because you go like 4 mana for 3 power is not very good, but 4 mana for 5 power is decent. And then 4 mana for 7 power is a really good deal. So, I mean, it takes a couple of turns for it to really scale up. But if you don't need it to do that, it's also stabilizing your board because you're playing your big creatures before you do that. So, yeah, I mean, the +1/+1 counter effect is also an instant speed ability, just like the mana ability. So we can do this at the end of turn if we want to play these on 4. We pass the next turn holding up, Tyvar Stand, Repulsive, all the cards we mentioned, right? And then we decide we don't need to do that. We can put +1 counters on them and keep growing. A lot to love here. This is a very powerful mana dork.
Yeah, it gives you the option, like the broken starts of 2-drop mana dork into this on turn 3 into like Titan of Industry on turn 4, which isn't possible with a lot of other cards. I assume we're defaulting to like, this is probably like an 80-20 split or something in terms of like how often we're just casting it on turn 2 versus how often we're like holding it to offspring. I mean, I guess like you're holding this and a different 2-drop in your hand. I guess it depends on the 2-drop, but like, are you trying to get full value off of this and playing a different 2-drop, or is this the card you're just running out on 2 to get the acceleration going?
Yeah, if I don't have a mana dork in play, I'm just going to play this.
I guess it depends on what the alternative play is, of course, but yeah. And Chris has mentioned Fanatic of Ronus. We just got that with MH3. We're not playing it, but for, we as Magic players got that. Right. Birds of Paradise is coming in for us. We've got this mana dork. There's actually even another mana dork in this set that we could have talked about. It lets you like forage to double ramp. And there's another mana dork coming out in Duskmourn that we've already seen that can like turn into a bunch of 2/2s later in the game.
I'm legitimately concerned that one is going to be too much, but
yeah, that one we'll talk about it in a month and a half or 2 months or whenever Duskmourn comes out. But
it's going to be the world's scariest pinata.
Yeah, we're in mana dork renaissance here. Like I mean, we're actually just like adding great mana dorks to our kit. It's kind of like the Black Sweepers I was talking about. Feels good to get some really pushed mana dorks, and it feels like something that Wizards is working on intentionally to try and get people to play like 2-drop mana dorks in highly accelerated games. So
it's almost like they're starting to figure out that printing 5 drops with every single word in the English language on them is not going to make green good, making the low drops that accelerating them is.
Yeah, so this is a nice pickup for sure. All right, next up we have Scrap Shooter. This is 1 green for a 4/4 rare raccoon archer. Love it. It has gift a card and reach, and when it enters the battlefield, if the gift was promised, destroy target artifact or enchantment an opponent controls. Nice way to sneak a good little Reclamation Sage into your cube if you need one without actually using a slot on a 3-mana 2/1 Reclamation Sage. I don't know that there's a lot to talk about here, but this card is super solid. You don't have to gift the card, so you could just run this out as 1 GG 4/4 reach, which is fine. And if you need to get a problematic permanent off the board, you have that option.
Yeah, big stat line in green where it's nice to get this without it being a super cascading snowball advantage that we've seen on a lot of the cards like this. Decent defensive utility, blocks, reach is a nice keyword these days with all the blue flyers, and then some flexible utility on an effect you usually have to give up something meaningful for. And like, you're giving your opponent a card, so you're not 2 for wanting them, but if you need to get a Great Henge off the board or whatever card, Cryptic Code or something off the board, it's nice to be able to actually do that.
Does 1 GG bother you guys at all, or does it bother you that this occupies like the same part in the curve as like a Bloated Contaminator? Are you putting them in the same deck? Are you sideboarding into this or main decking it? Is it just like none of that really that much of a concern?
I think I would probably just main deck this, right? Because like this is what I want Reclamation Sage to look like. I'm sure that in an environment with a ton of broken artifacts and enchantments and like combo pieces, Rec Sage could conceivably just be better, because it's really important that you deny them the combo piece and you don't want to give them a card. But the whole point of what makes this card attractive to me is like, I really just despise playing like borderline sideboard cards in your cube. There's something that really bothers me about that. I also don't think it's good design. And I think the point of this card is that you can main deck it.
How do you guys feel about Raccoonmation Sage?
Raccoonmation Sage?
I was going to go with Trashclamation Sage. We're all just gonna struggle here to come up with
right.
who can come up with the worst name here.
This is why I had to get Nesto Angel in, because
I guess we self-fulfilling prophecy there on that one.
Yeah, and also that was the first good one I ever came up with. I would never look at this and be like, oh, there's a funny name to give this thing.
It's a good one. It's a good one. Let's close out green with a couple more spells here. We've got Hunter's Talent. Teld and I gushed about this one in the Peasant Review. Spoiler
We will be gushing about this in the
I'm sure in the next bonus episode we'll gush about this.
That they haven't recorded yet.
Yes, of course. Hunter's Talent, 1 in a green for a class enchantment. Level 1, when it enters, target creature you control punches target creature you don't control. So just straight up Rabid Bite for 2 mana. Level 2 costs 1 in a green. Whenever you attack, target attacking creature gets +1/+0 and gains trample until end of turn. And then if you get to level 3, it's just more gravy, 3 in a green. At the beginning of your end step, if you control a creature with power 4 or greater, draw a card. And, I mean, everything we kind of said about this in the Peasant Review stands here as well. So I guess I would like to hear mostly what Chris thinks about this, and then Teld if you think this has, any different applications here than it will as just a generically powerful card in any cube. I'd like to hear that too.
So they've really been going hard on the green removal in the last little while, haven't they? We keep getting good ways for green to interact with creatures. I guess maybe this is just a concession to the fact that they keep printing creatures that you kind of have to interact with. Even if your board is bigger, they're difficult to ignore. Mm-hmm. I don't know. But in any case, Rabid Bite itself is not particularly good, but when it comes attached to a mana sink whose modes, frankly, for a green deck are not particularly expensive, that's just a really good package. A lot of green creatures, at least that we're playing, already have trample, but notably if you're playing stuff like Kogla or Thragtusk or creatures, because I don't think Thragtusk has native trample. Green creatures like that don't have native trample, I mean, giving them trample makes them significantly better. And then the last mode, I don't think is as good as the last mode on Ranger class, but this is stapled to a piece of removal. It's kind of funny that it's probably the best class in the whole set, right?
It definitely is, yeah.
You know what's really funny about this card, guys? This is a piece of removal that Felia can blink.
That it is, yeah.
Oh, jeez, yeah. That's brutal.
Yeah, so it's weird because this was also one of the earlier classes spoiled, if I remember correctly. So I had fairly high hopes for them. After they spoiled this, I was like, man, all right, this is a banger. I think in the main cube, this is a little bit worse, obviously, than in Peasant, where you take a bit of a hit on the efficiency. But I think overall, the package is still good. The floor is high enough that we're still fine playing it, and the ceiling is probably a little lower here because the games are faster. But just having that flexibility of removal spell plus mana sink in my green deck is always nice.
I don't even, I didn't even consider thinking about this as, inefficient removal. Obviously, Rabid Bite's not that good of a card, but, it hasn't quite processed to me yet that they've been pushing the removal like this down to 1 mana with cards like, Hard Hitting Question and Horrific Assault from Modern Horizons, just 1 mana punch spells. So, in my mind, this sort of effect with upside still costs 2 mana, so I don't even, think of this as inefficient. But maybe we are at a point where just, 2 mana in green to, 1-for-1 a creature is inefficient, and we should be expecting a little bit better from that, given what we already have.
I think so. I think at 2 mana, it has to do something pretty substantial. Maybe not pretty substantial, but it has to do some extra stuff, right? Because now we get hard hitting question on 1. So if we're paying,
this does
do extra stuff. It's a little interesting that the value of it isn't on the fight itself, but is pushed out to other parts of the card. But I think in the context of cube, it actually just makes for a better card, because when you play your green creature and your Rabid Bite, you probably didn't need a stat buff on your green creature to kill anything, because the green creature is just bigger anyways.
Yeah, I mean, I also am a fan of, removal that does more stuff later in the game. A good example of that is Invasion of Tarkir, which is a card I go up and down on, and then, it always looks good when I'm down on it, so I'm like, oh, I'm back up on it. But, that's, 2 mana, come in, Shaka, target, and then from there, you can eventually turn it into, an actual game-winning threat. And this is very similar in that it's just more interesting to me when the removal is more than just point and click and get a thing off the board. And I do find this very interesting and quite powerful as well. And again, look at this art. Look at this art.
I know.
It's not
it's great.
Great art for... Anyway. another one we touched on in Peasant Cube. And Chris, just to fill you in on this one, so Overprotect, 1 in a green instant, target creature you control gets +3/+3, trample, hexproof, indestructible, flanking, rampage 2 until end of turn. It just gets everything you need.
Annihilator 3.
Banding.
So just to fill you in on the conversation from the Peasant Cube, in that cube, we knew that we wanted to cut Tyvar's stand from an efficiency reason and a lot of complaints around that. So like we had an easy swap there for what we considered to be just like a card that's maybe a notch below Tyvar's stand, but I don't think we're planning on cutting Tyvar's stand to play this card.
No.
So this is going to coexist with it. Where are you at on Overprotect?
Tyvar stand is way better than this, like way better. Like the difference between being able to like sneak out a 3-drop on 4 and hold up Tyvar stand versus being able to play a 2-drop and hold up Overprotect is really huge. Tyvar stand also, you can sink a massive amount of mana into it to turn it into Fireball. Like this can't touch Tyvar stand. However, if you compare this to casting Tyvar stand for X equals 1, it's just an insane amount of additional stats. And as we've discovered, like a protection spell that gives something hexproof and indestructible is really big game, because it just like it has combat implications, it has targeting implications. Your creature like making it hexproof doesn't protect it from wraths, but effects like this do. And +3/+3 in trample is a ton of stats. So I would say that I expect this to be pretty good. I think you want these effects generally to be 1 mana, but the stats that you get and the combination of trample, hexproof, and indestructible I think is worth the price of admission, especially later in the game when green decks are likely to have extra mana, even after they've cast their threat for the turn. Sometimes this is going to be like 2 mana kill your opponent, or it's going to be 2 mana, my 2/2 creature eats your 5/5, or, you know, what have you. I mean, if your green opponent attacks into you with 2 mana up, like, you're going to need to be legitimately concerned. Because if it's Tyvar stand, you can just block a smaller creature with a bigger creature and it's not going to get through. But the amount of stats that this puts on a creature, all of a sudden, like, you're not safe in combat if they have Overprotect in their hand.
Yeah. Teld, anything else to add here? Do you expect this to play out roughly the same as we think it will in the Peasant Cube?
Yeah, I mean, just like I said with the Hunter's Talent, obviously when you get to Peasant Cube, it's okay to be a little clunkier, so I think the downside here will be a little less, but the problem with 2 mana in Cube is like 1 mana you can kind of hide the Tyvar stand, right? If you just like have a forest untapped or have a dork untapped and they had a creature that could block it, it doesn't really give away the game. But at 2 mana, you start to lose some of the edge that Tyvar Stand has of the surprise, because it's pretty obvious most of the time that if you spend a bunch of mana and then you kind of fiddled with it so that you had 2 up, it's a little more obvious. I still think this card's going to be pretty good. We've seen Trash the Town even at 3, 4, 5 mana be pretty decent. And I think the fact that this one is going to come in at a lower rate is going to get you more blowouts. You're never going to be trading off your creature as long as you play it appropriately. And you know, you're going to be able to do that to push damage. It's going to be really good with like Menace creatures or Death Touchers or anything like that. So yeah, I think this card's good. It's stapling 2 effects together that are already usually the best commons in retail sets. And I think when you combine that total package, it's worth testing, if nothing else, at the cube level.
I hope to see like a combat trick or 2 in the other non-green colors that, you know, do enough to be worth including in like a relatively powerful cube, because, you know, we're in a situation right now where if your opponent has like 1 mana up and you're just like, okay, like the only card that I just like lose to here is Tyvar Stand, like how likely do they have it? I realize this costs.
They always have it. That's the joke.
Right, they always have it. That's the key. Yeah, Tyvar Stand also has a secret line of text with it where you start with this in your opening hand. But having 2 effects, like especially if your opponent just goes to combat before they cast anything, having 2 potential effects in their deck that will just completely blow you out in combat creates some really meaningful tension around combat and around removal timing, which I think is a fun dynamic.
And to the listener, if you're wondering why we're spending so much time talking about a combat trick like this, a pretty simple effect, I would go back in our catalog. I think it's episode 24. We had an entire episode on combat tricks and where we think they stand in not Commander, in Cube these days. If you haven't caught on, we like them quite a bit when they're pushed like this. So Also, I mentioned in the other episode, great flavor text. This set just has good flavor text across the board. So
I've really appreciated the return of flavor text. It's nice.
I actually want to read this one. The flavor text is Blur's defenses are impervious. Blur the impervious.
It's great. Teld, do you want to go ahead and kick us off the gold section with Glarb, who apparently is like a king who has ice powers in Bloomburrow? Just fun little lore fact there for you.
Sure. So Glarb, Calamity's Augur, is Sultai mana, so that's black, blue, green, for a legendary frog wizard noble. It has Death Touch. You may look at the top card of your library at any time. You may play lands and cast spells with mana value 4 or greater from the top of your library, and you can tap Glarb to surveil 2. So our cube has had a historic problem with snowbally 3-mana cards that start generating a lot of advantage and push the game really ahead and have great stat lines with 4 toughness. I think this is probably going to do the same thing as all those other cards did, but it's in 3 colors, so you have to work a little bit to get it.
3 colors, yeah.
Just going to say, like, the turn you play it, if your opponent doesn't remove it immediately, you're going to have good blocks. And then once you've untapped, the Surveil 2 means you're probably hitting a land drop on the next turn, which allows you to probably guarantee that you can play that into potentially a 4-drop, depending on how your draws line up. But it's really hard to not start generating value off of this, especially if you're playing a bigger deck. But just being able to play the Augur Bottoms, Courser, or Crufix play lands off the top of your deck will be powerful enough on its own. And then when you have other stuff to do on top of that, it's gonna be quite good.
Yeah, I agree with everything you just said. I will say that I think the 3 drops with 4 toughness problem largely revolved around Red's complete and utter inability to deal with that. Don't get me wrong, like, we learned from Preacher of the Schism that 2/4 Death Touch is like a fucking insane stat line, right? Because, like, even if you double block this, it's taking both creatures with it. It's going to profitably block a 3/3. It's going to trade with everything. It does not die to your bolt variants. Now we've got a lot more like Lava Coil style cards than Lightning Strike style cards. But I think it's a fair package for 3 mana. And I like that we finally have a Sultai card that I think is worth playing, because I'm interested in playing a couple more 3 color cards if we can. Like, this doesn't have like a super thematic like Sultai effect, but like this is like a pretty nice Sultai value card, right? Like, fill your graveyard, generate card advantage, fix the top of your library, blocks well. And what we've seen is, like, Squeefoot is really fucking insane, but you don't see it every single draft because having Jund mana on turn 3 is not the easiest thing in the world to do. So, I mean, yes, this will be a very powerful way to start off your game if you cast it on 3, but, like, having perfect Sultai mana on turn 3 is not a given, even if your mana base is really good. So I think that this card is really strong, but I think that its intense mana requirements make me okay with that.
I think this is got in 3 colors, and you also have to untap with it, and you have to tap it to some percentage of the time. You're going to have to tap it to get the value, which is going to take it off blocks. So, I mean, there's definitely some stuff you can counterplay with this, and like you said, the mana won't work out perfectly. Although somebody's gonna cast this on turn 2 off of a dork in some games, and this is gonna be ridiculous, I'm sure.
Birds of Paradise, baby.
But yeah, I think it's interesting. It's a cool design. Like, I was also kind of hoping for a good Sultai card, and I think this encourages more of like the fill up your, the Surveil 2 being able to like fuel for like Uro or the Osteomancer we looked at, these like grindy cards that all want graveyard space. This could be a glue card for that sort of deck. I expect to see this in like every deck Persian drafts for the next, month.
Yeah.
The more I read this card, the more powerful it reads to me. First off, tap Surveil 2 is like a way stronger ability than it looks like. Like, it looks like just like, oh, here's text to make the rest of the stuff work, but when you actually
it's close to draw card.
Break down what that means, it's like, for all my graveyard stuff turned on, perfect. Like, I'm just turboing through my graveyard if I need to. And I already mentioned how we don't have a lot of turbo self-mill. This kind of fits that role. It means every single draw step is going to be something you need, whether it's a land or not. And the combination of that and the Courser of Crufix ability to play a land off the top of your library means, like, assuming that you hit a land on top of your library, which you can set up with Surveil 2 very easily, like, this is effectively just drawing you a card every turn at minimum by letting you set up a land on top. So, like, I mean, if you read this as 3 mana, 2/4, Death Touch, fill up your graveyard, draw a card every turn, even if the card is always a land, that's kind of an incredible card. And then I haven't put a lot of stock into the whole, like, cast spells with mana value 4 or greater from the top, but that's just a thing you can do, which is more card advantage, which is excellent because those are going to be really impactful spells when you do it. So the more I read this, the more I think, like, assuming that you have a responsible mana base and can cast it, it should be a very good card. And I do like that it's mitigated by 3 colors, so you can't just, like, toss it in any deck. Though people will try.
You know what's going to be a really cool line is if you, like, if it doesn't have Summoning Sickness and you, like, Surveil 2 EOT, and you have a land on top and then, like, a Questing Beast second, you just reorder them, draw the Questing Beast, play the land off the top, play the Questing Beast, draw a card. I'm a fan.
Should be cool. Glarb on my Narb, you know? Chris, talk to me about this Orzhov card.
Okay, so we have Zoraline. I'm going to go with Zoraline Cosmos Caller. It's 1, a white, and a black for a 3/3 Bat Cleric with flying and vigilance. Whenever a bat you control attacks, you gain 1 life. You should basically read this as when it attacks, you gain 1 life. And whenever it enters or attacks, you may pay a white and a black and 2 life. When you do, return target non-land permanent card with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield with finality counter on it. So somebody made the joke that this is like fixed Lurrus, and since it's a set about, like, critters, like fixed Lurrus, get it, haha. But yeah, I mean, this is a cool Orzhov card for sure. It's not as powerful as Lurrus is because you can't do the companion insanity, you know, yada yada yada. But this is like a nice recursion engine. The fact that you can do this on ETB if you have like a different 3-drop, because of the recursion mode on it, like, you're probably going to want to play a different 3-drop first anyway, right? To increase the likelihood you'll have traded something off. It's also really nice for when you draw it like a little later in the game. If you top it and you have 5 mana, you can get value out of it immediately. And then if you get to swing with it even once and you have another impactful permanent to bring back, it just costs 2 life, but it mitigates that a little bit by gaining a little bit of life. It's not free, but if you're getting like a 3-drop back for 2 mana, you're sort of up on tempo. Yeah, I think that this is a good package. I really do. Right now we're playing Comball, the 2/4 that drains when you make tokens and also copies any tokens that your opponent makes. I think it only triggers once per turn when it does that, though. I like that card, but I do understand that, again, in some board states, it's just like, okay, I guess I shouldn't activate my Planeswalkers or play this creature or, you know, anything. It's actually really funny when Comball, like, you cast one of the white removal spells with downside, but it just, like, it doesn't break parity, it creates parity.
Well, no, it breaks parity because then you also ping them for 1 or 2.
Oh yeah, fair play. So anyway, going back to the card at hand, what I like about this too is that this is obviously good for your, like, sacrifice-oriented decks, getting back your Blood Artists that have been dealt with, or, you know, like your sacrifice outlets that have been dealt with, or whatever. But this isn't sacrifice specific. This is just a good combination of stats and an ability for just a straight up Orzhov aggro deck. So if you just have a generic Orzhov aggro deck in your cube and you're not really focusing on sacrificey shit, this is just perfectly good there too. I think that this is a great Orzhov creature.
Yeah, it also fits. I mean, we added Rafine to the cube, right? And this fits in that same sort of, like, Esper creature shell. It fits into, like, the theoretical Abzan shell that we've talked about before, of just, like, those low to the ground value creature and tokens and stuff. So I think this card's going to play pretty well. I think it's a 5-mana card. It's okay. And as a 3-mana card, it's okay. I don't think either mode is super good, but I think the fact that you can do either one, so just being able to play this as a 3-drop and then, you know, start generating value on the next turn or generating life while dealing flying damage, I think that gives it a lot of play. Mm-hmm. So I don't think this is the kind of card that, it doesn't strike me as a forever card unless it plays way better than it reads, but it does look like the kind of card that fits a nice niche in the cube at the moment, which is nice. Just like a good value creature that's got a reasonable enough stat line and a little bit of modality in the way you can play it.
They keep one-upping themselves on these Orzhov 3-drops. We were on Teysa, Opulent Oligarch, when Murders came out, into Kemball on Thunder Junction, into this now. It's like, are we? What's the Orzhov rare going to be?
What's our Duskmourn 3-mana rare going to be? Yeah.
We just keep one-upping ourselves.
No, real quick, notably, it's non-land permanent. So in cubes that are running Business Blossom, it does mean business. Bitter Blossom, which we don't because it's such an obnoxious card. But if your opponent, like, you play Bitter Blossom and your opponent's like enchantment removal spell, get fucked nerd, and then you recur this, like they're probably not dealing with it a second time. Yeah, like your flipped wedding announcement, if your opponent like decides they have to pop it, or like they pop your ossification that you've cast to remove one of their creatures or whatever, being able to recur non-creature permanents is like pretty huge.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're definitely guano try this out. So.
Jesus Christ! Oh God!
All right.
I have a hernia, Tim. You got to stop doing that.
I think this set review is sucking the life out of Chris over there.
I mean, I'm actually having fun with it. I just you guys can just keep. I'm just like every time I feel like you can't shock me anymore. It's just like, ugh.
I feel like we have to say it like, what is this? It's me, the infamous Cruel Claw. Like, I don't know, is that how he refers to himself?
It's me.
His name's probably
he's a weasel. He's a weasel.
Like, yeah, give me all your money.
Oh no, it's Cruel Claw. It's the infamous Cruel Claw.
I don't know. He's a weasel. He probably has a French accent. Let's be honest.
Also a mercenary, outlaw. All right, one black red for the infamous Cruel Claw. 3/3 mythic rare legendary weasel mercenary. It has menace. When it deals combat damage to a player, exile cards from the top of your library until you exile a non-land. You may cast that card by discarding a card rather than paying its mana cost. So 3 mana, 3/3 menace, hit you, dig for my next spell, cast it by pitching a card from my hand. No mana investment required. I think this card is good enough. It's not really like thematic for Rakdos or anything. It just happens to be Rakdos colors. You want to play this card in your cube, go for it. I expect this is the type of card they'll test out in Vintage Cube because it's the like sneak attack, cheaty face kind of stuff that people get excited about. But man, the highs on this card are really high, and the lows are still probably pretty good most of the time. But the highs are like, turn 4, I hit you with this in my Jund deck, and I cast Titan of Industry for free, and the game is over. So like, this is like definitionally polarity as in the way that we prefer not to.
Oh yeah, at its finest.
Cube. Yeah.
Here's Grave Titan, discard a land.
Yeah, I mean it's a guaranteed mana advantage, right? Because you're spending 0 mana and you're getting some amount of mana for whatever spell you hit. Right. And then it's also sometimes going to be card advantage once you've gotten to a point where you no longer need to make your land drops, or if you're able to discard cards like Fiery Temper or something like that, if that's the kind of thing you're running.
Not to interrupt, but that's a very important thing to note here, is that this card is not card disadvantage. If you have to discard a card to cast a spell, that's just card parity. Like, that's not card disadvantage. You are going down a card in your hand, but you're up whatever you cast.
You know, Teld, that's interesting. I didn't even think about this as a madness enabler, but if you have a ton of madness cards in your deck, if you're doing that as like a theme in your cube, like this is a really nasty enabler.
Yeah, that's true. Cast a Fiery Temper and then also cast another spell for free. That's kind of sick. And 3 mana, 3/3 menace, again, like that's just a good starting point. It's not blowing anybody away, but that's a good starting line, especially on a creature with a Saboteur ability. So
in the removal colors that also, unlike a lot of the previous versions, so one of the we put Tiny Bones in the cube for a little while, and one of the problems with that card was that even if you could clear the way with removal to hit them with it, oftentimes you didn't have enough mana left over to actually do anything with it. But on this card, if you just cast your removal spell and then you hit them with it, Cruel Claw doesn't care. You don't need mana. You just discard your card.
Yeah, and as Teld pointed out, this is like crazy tempo advantage, because like let's say you hit like, you untap, you've got 4 mana, you know, and you like, I don't know, you hit like a good 3-drop off the top, and you just like discard another 3-drop. That might not sound like a good deal, but like you literally just traded in the first 3-drop for the second 3-drop to cast it for free, and then you can still cast your 4-drop on the same turn.
Cruel Claw just spotted you a Black Lotus.
Yeah, so like even if it's not like hitting something crazy and casting it for free, like if you're hitting like a 3-drop or better and casting it for free, even if you're discarding a meaningful card to do that, that's a ton of tempo. And it's a 3/3 menace, you know, it's going to die. It dies to Lightning Strike. You have to untap with it. The keyword menace on this actually is like one of the better keywords they could have given, because as Teld mentioned, it's in the removal color. So like untapping with this and clearing the way for it's not going to be that complicated. So you could make arguments about whether or not it's quote unquote too powerful. I think the reason that we're not interested in it is if you connect, it is really powerful. And when it connects, it's kind of like spinning a lottery wheel, and some game ending shit can just immediately happen. And it's going to produce some really feels baddie moments. And we're not interested in that.
Yeah, one last thing about this card is because you are in the removal color, you're going to want to pair this with removal to some degree. Just be aware that when you discard, you know, if you're playing a lot of removal, you might hit a removal spell off this. So if your opponent has an empty board, maybe we don't want to do this if our deck has, 10 removal spells in it or something.
You do get to know what you're exiling before you decide whether you're discarding a card, so you always have, like, the information.
You don't even have to do it.
Oh, you do? That's worded differently. I thought it was discard, then do it. Okay, yeah.
Also, obligatory, this is good with Prosper. Anyway. I'm going to take Hugs here because I'm in love with this card. Sorry. But Hugs Grizzly Guardian is X red, red, green, green for a 5/5 mythic rare legendary Badger Warrior. It has trample, and when it enters the battlefield, exile the top X cards of your library until end of your next turn. You may play those cards. It also has the static ability. You may play an additional land on each of these turns. So start off red, red, green, green, 5/5 trample. That's pretty good, but the restrictive mana cost is also going to kind of balance that out to the point where I think it's just okay. And then any spare mana you want to dump into this turns into extra impulsive draws until your next turn. Which, let's just imagine this small ball scenario of X equals 1. This is probably a 5 mana 5/5 that lets you play an additional land and draws you a card. And that's okay. That's a good starting point. And of course it scales from there, 6, 7, 8 mana, which is not inconceivable in games. Like, you're going to draw a bigger grip of cards, but you only have like a turn's window to actually play them. The card I want to compare this to, and I know it's not an exact comparison, but like it really gives me Escape to the Wilds vibes. That is the 5 mana sorcery, exile the top 5 of your library. You have until the end of your next turn to play them, and you can play an additional land that turn. This gives you that whole additional land thing. So if you dump a bunch of mana into this and you exile a pile of spells and lands, you do get to go up on mana the same way you would with Escape to the Wilds. Plus, you can always just play another land from your hand if you have one as well on any turn. And then hopefully you have a couple other spells to rattle off over the next couple turns. So this is not like, oh, this is Gruul's best card or anything, but I do really like this card. I think it's a sweet little scaling creature for Gruul. Obviously, it's not super splashable, but that didn't stop Kogla and Yadaro from being an excellent card in our cube. Also has a red, red, green, green creature. So I'm excited about this one. I expect good things from this. I think like my baseline is think of this as a 5-drop, and then from there it's just all gravy and upside.
Yeah, I like this card too. I finally got to a place where I was ready to test it over Escape to the Wilds, not least of which because the mana cost on this is demanding enough that you can't just like slap this in your Persian deck, which is what we're going to be calling multicolor decks from now on. It's decidedly a Gruul card, and I agree with you 100%. I mean, I think it's nice that a slightly overstated creature for the cost can be the emergency mode. But if you top deck this with like a relatively arbitrary amount of mana later in the game, it provides significant card advantage. I don't think it's like slam dunk amazing powerful, but I think it's good.
Slightly above average is probably where I'd come in, which is a good place to be.
I think it's a good card.
Yeah, I think this will end up looking, as far as draft goes, I mean, it'll probably be one of those cards like Kogla and Yadara that's most of the time going to be the last card in the pack. But when it's not, it's going to be one of the better cards in your deck. And I think the upside there will be enjoyable enough to try it out. It's possible having multiple like red, red, green, green cards gets a little awkward, but I actually don't really hate that. I mean, I think again, just like, if you want to play these cards, draft your lands, and I think if it encourages people to play Gruul, whatever, that's cool.
It's good. It's good and not good, but one thing I really love about restrictive mana costs for stuff like this is, like, you can strategically choose when you're going to try and wheel something like this if you're the Gruul player, whereas that's not the case with something like a Bloodbraid Elf, right? Because there might just be, like, some other person playing green, black, red, little R who wants your Bloodbraid Elf, but most of the time you're going to get Hugs on the wheel if you're the dedicated Golgari player. Gruul player.
I think this card's going to create less, like, really high, crazy moments than Escape to the Wild, but it's going to be way more consistent, because I've got some clips that I've done on my Twitch channel where it's like me casting Escape to the Wild with an Narcomancer in play and then like untap and just cast like 10 mana worth of spells, and it's just
Escape's
like
good.
When Escape is good, and Escape is an amazing highlight reel card, right? When you get those moments and you get to like do the thing with Escape to the Wild, it looks really cool. But I think this card's gonna be much more consistent, where you'll play it for 5, 6, 7 mana. It'll draw somewhere between like 1 to 3 impulse draw cards, and then it'll be, it'll get you some more gas for down the road.
You know what's going to be really, really disheartening is when you think you're like in Gruul, you think you're in the right lane, you should by all rights wheel this card, and then you don't.
Yeah.
The only time I don't see Kogla and Yadaro in at the end of a pack is when I choose to draft Gruul. Someone just understands that I'm drafting Gruul and decides to take my invitational card from me.
Chris, we've got Gev next, which is another lore tidbit for you. Gev and Hugs are best friends.
Oh wow, that's pretty cool. I just think that it is a 2-drop creature that's priced to move for aggro. It's a 1 black, 1 red for a 3/2 lizard mercenary. It has ward of pay 2 life, so I mean obviously you can remove it, but it'll have gotten some damage in. And then other creatures you control enter with an additional +1/+1 counter on them for each opponent who lost life this turn. Whenever you cast a lizard spell, it deals 1 damage to target opponent. So, I mean, you're going to ignore that, like, for the most part. So it's like it's a 2 mana 3/2 with ward pay 2 life that gives all of your other creatures Bloodthirst 1. This isn't like going to break anybody's brain, but if you're just looking for an aggressive Rakdos, like a fun Rakdos aggressive creature, I think this is a pretty good one.
Mm-hmm. All the wizards in this set, they don't have a named mechanic, but it was pretty obvious on the red 1-drop and the black offspring 1-drop that, like, the wizard theme in red-black is like spectacle, bloodthirst, whatever. They just didn't keyword anything because it's worded a little bit differently. But that's what's going on with the red-black wizards.
I think in powerful environments, this card's biggest knock I can think against it ultimately is that it's competing at the same mana slot as Bloodtithe Harvester, that is just one of the all-timer Magic cards. I mean, that's not really this card's fault that Bloodtithe Harvester is a completely ridiculous card, but it is in the same mana slot.
Yeah. I like this better than Harvester, but the reality is that Harvester is like still pretty good in your aggressive deck, and you'll also just put it in your like Jundi mid-range deck. Yeah, it's nice. So moving on to the next card, I'm going to let somebody else talk about it, but I just wanted to make a comment first in case it got lost in the sauce. So I put this on the document. It wasn't originally on the document. And I was like, I wonder if the other 2 guys are going to look at me like I have 3 heads for wanting to talk about this card, because I'm not really sure if it's going to be good enough. And then Tim was like, yeah, I was going to put this on the document, but I wanted to see what you guys had to say because I was worried about what you might say. And then Teld was like, oh my god, me too. I was going to put it on the document, but I didn't want to be like laughed out of the frat house or whatever. So somebody else can read it. I just thought it was funny that we were all like, I don't know, here's this thing that I like, and I don't know if you guys are going to like it.
I didn't want to be bullied. I get bullied sometimes, so I didn't want to be bullied. But, when we all have the same opinion. Like...
I was afraid this was another Invasion of Lorwyn situation.
I don't remember that, and I don't think that's a memory I need to dig up in the middle of a recording. So, Teld, if I recall correctly, you've actually had a chance to play against this already.
Yeah, I have. So yeah, we're talking about Dream Dew Entrancer. It is 2 blue-green for a 3/4 frog wizard at rare. It has reach, and when it ETBs, you can tap up to 1 target creature, put 3 stun counters on it. If you controlled that creature, you draw 2 cards. So this card is one that the more you read it, the more you kind of think about all the things you could do with it, which is pretty cool. But at its base, it's kind of a blue-green Necrotal meets a blue-green like Fell Stinger. I think the standard play pattern is going to be ETBs, taps my opponent's best card, and we're smacking your face with our Simic Tempo deck. But I think if you're playing this, especially in other colors where you have access to creature tokens and things like that, like if you have a 1/1 token laying around, you can target the 1/1 token, draw 2 cards, you've cashed it in, is almost like almost like a Fell Stinger. It's going to pair really well with cards like Ephemerate and Soul Herder, obviously, on multiple levels. And then even in an emergency, and you really don't want to do this, but if you really just need gas, you could cast this as a really awkward Divination Anticipate. I think most of the time, though, you're either going to be tapping down like a 1/1 mana dork that you no longer need and drawing 2 cards, or you're going to be tapping down your opponent's best card. And given the way we're kind of curating the blue-green decks, being more towards this that cocaine tempo deck that we keep talking about, I think that you're probably just going to tap your opponent's creature most of the time when you play that. So, but I think it's really good. Like, tapping for 3 turns is basically killing it. For all intents and purposes, that creature is dead if it doesn't have a static ability. And in some cases, it's better than a removal spell if it's like a Workshop War Chief or an Aklazotz or something. In some cases, it will be better because your opponent, if you just shoot a removal spell on it, could get it back in some manner.
This card is dope. Mm-hmm. I don't know. It doesn't read like a a rare from 2024, but I bet it plays like one. That's probably the way I can frame it best. You already mentioned like Soul Herder and stuff. This is the type of card that's gonna like produce little mini combos too because of all the different moving parts. Like Bloated Contaminator into this, where you get to proliferate the stun counters, is nice. Being able to dump the stun counters on like your Sleep Cursed Fairy, which can then like take the counters off, is really cool. Like,
yeah, my opponent at the pre-release went something along the lines of like Pawn Profit, play this, tap my Pawn Profit, draw a bunch of cards, play. He had Gossip's Talent in play with he ended up like leveling it up with the duo card that blinks, and then he blinked like 4 times and just tapped down my board a bunch and then flickered a Beza, and I was just, this is silly. This is just nonsense.
So for the longest time, as long as I can fucking remember, Simic cards have been big, expensive, dumb thing that either can't be interacted with or generate some kind of card advantage, or a big, dumb thing that explores, because the only thing that we can think of for Simic to do is that it draws a card and plays extra lands. That's blue.
Or you forgot the other flavor of Simic card, which is completely broken 3-drop.
Oh yeah, there is that.
Which does those other things too.
That does those other things. I really like that they seem to be on this path of a significantly more fun Simic identity, which is combining blue and green things means you can put good stats on a creature and make it do strong tempo stuff.
Bonnie Paul was a lot of fun.
Yeah, well, Bonnie Paul is just, God, don't get me started on how fucking stupid that card is. Some of the dumbest cards ever made are Simic, like Bonnie Paul. Obviously, the original Oko, Coma Cosmos Serpent is just ridiculously dumb. Nadu, yeah. But yeah, I don't know how. Wow, I must have worked really hard to erase that from my memory. But yeah, it does all the things that the guys already said that it does. 3/4 reach isn't huge for 4. I bet in like a more souped up set, this would have been like a little larger. But it is a meaningful add to the board, and notably in the cocaine style deck we keep talking about, which is essentially like flash creatures, counter spells, combat tricks, things of that nature, you're probably playing a number of flyers that have 2 or 3 power. And sometimes you're not even going to tap down like your opponent's strongest creature. If you're successfully racing them, you're going to tap down the only creature they have that can keep your flyers from just beating them to death. And 3 turns is going to be long enough. Or, if they have something like an Aquazotz, that if it starts attacking, you're completely fucked. Like, this is just better than Doomblading it, just completely taking it out of the equation for 3 turns. Just a good tempo play.
Yeah, 4 mana 3/4 reach is not a super busted stat line, but it's the type of stat line on this kind of card that makes me believe that somebody spent a lot of time trying to balance this card and spent a lot of intentional time like trying to make the set good, rather than just trying to impress me with giant stat lines, which has been a huge complaint of mine recently. Same with that otter we talked about, the 1/2 otter,
We played Ravenous Chupacabra and it was a 2/2, and this is a lot bigger than that. Yeah. So how bad could it be?
Chris, you've been talking a little bit about 3-color cards here, and you've got a little token maker here you want to talk about.
Yeah, so just for some context for like why I keep looking at Naya Tokens cards, we decided to give Jetmir a try because I was making the argument that it was good enough. And then it turned out that Jetmir just kind of ended up, because the mana in our cube is really good, we're running 5 duels in each color. One of them is a fetch land, and 2 of the other ones are fetchable with that fetch land. So mana's pretty good, and 3-color cards are not as hard to cast as they might be in some other environments. Jetmir was often just kind of like better Craterhoof Behemoth for 4 mana. So it got cut just because people were miserable getting dunked on by it. Anyway, the card that caught my eye is Balin the Haymaker. It is red, green, white for a 4/3 legendary creature, Rabbit Warrior. The first line is tap 2 untapped tokens you control, add 1 mana of any color. The second is tap 3 untapped creatures or tokens you control. It's tokens, not creatures, so food, whatever. Draw a card, and then the third line is tap 4 untapped tokens you control. Put 3 +1/+1 counters on Balin the Haymaker against trample until end of turn. So this is a really, really cool tokens card. All the modes require that you kind of tap a lot of tokens at the same time, which ultimately kind of led me to believe that this is probably like a commander build-around, because you're always going to have access to it. You just fill your deck full of, excellent token makers. You're not going to be under as much pressure as you are in like a heads-up game, which gives you more time to generate synergies, etc. So I think it's a cool card. I don't think it's necessarily a heads-up Magic card. If you're running a lower power cube with like a heavy tokens theme, I think this is a really cool build around, but I think in a really fast, powerful cube, this probably is just asking too much for something that doesn't make any tokens itself.
Yeah, I think I actually agree with you that this one is in fact a commander card.
Yes, this one is. Which is interesting that there are three color creatures in this set. Like, I don't know, like, they're characters in the story, I guess, so you make cards for them, but it's weird that they do, like, the commander precons with every set, but still have the need to, like, put commander
cards in.
And it's like, oh, don't you have, like, a product for that? But, yeah, if you want to read more about Balin the Haymaker, you can catch DraftSim.com's Balin the Haymaker commander guide coming out on Monday.
Nice.
Which will be way before this episode comes out, but...
all right, well, we're going for Paradox Engine food combo, right? That's what we're doing?
No, Paradox Engine banned in Commander. Can't do that.
Oh, is it banned in Commander?
Yes.
That makes a lot of sense to me, actually.
That shows you how long it's been since I played a game of Commander, because last time I played, it was legal and in my deck.
Let's go and wrap this up. One more card. It's one of the Imagine Courageous Critters cards, and it's a doozy of a classic here. It's a card I've been wanting for a very long time. Baleful Strix, blue-black, 1/1. Rare artifact creature, bird, has flying, death touch, and when it enters the battlefield, draw a card. Probably literally one of the like top 5 best Magic the Gathering card designs of all time. Whether it holds up or not in different formats, not part of the conversation because we're definitely going to play it here. But man, what a clean Magic card and a good one. Just a natural 2-for-1 that you can put in a deck and it will do the thing every single time. Love this guy.
We like clean cards here on the Jank Tank.
Did you guys ever play Ori and the Blind Forest?
The first little bit, not enough. I know the reference you're making here with the owl creature,
this looks like the big bad from that game. I wonder if that's where they got inspired, because Ori's another one of those games that's kind of got the Bloomburrow-y, whimsy, fluffy creatures thing going on. Anyways, sick art. I actually think this is my favorite art Strix has had, so I'm glad that this is the one we've got on the client. And it's, I mean, just a rock solid card, great design. Somehow was printed as an uncommon the first time around.
Minor complaint here. The Imagine Courageous Critters thing, like the whole point of what that was like, what if we took these creatures and repurposed them as non-canonical versions of themselves if they visited Bloomburrow? So like Tameo became a rabbit and Jace became a fox, but then like half of this bonus sheet of cards, whatever you want to call it, is just like birds that went to Bloomburrow and became birds. Like that, it's not quite what you were trying to sell me on for this product, but I'll take Birds of Paradise and Baleful Strix if that's what you want to give me. And then you know what? They even threw in like Derevi for the commander players and stuff like that. So it's a little minor complaint that there's so many birds on this sheet of 25 cards, but I'll take the ones we got.
Yeah, not a whole lot extra I can add. One thing I will say is I really, as I mentioned earlier, I really don't like it when we get cards with alt arts and they don't just give us the regular arts, because I'm like a super boring person who does not play with alternate arts or full arts or anything like that because I have a uniformity obsession. But if we are going to get stuck with playing an alternate art version of a card and that's all we get, this is real sick.
Mm-hmm. Missed opportunity for them to not just sell the original arts, because people would buy it. Like Jace the Mind Sculptor art for 600 gems, losers, and like they just make $6 billion or whatever. That's it. That was the last card. That's a lot to get through here, and a lot of this is stuff we're actually going to be playing on top of stuff that we thought was just interesting to talk about, or due diligence. Let's mention this for the broader Cube community, but why don't we go ahead and close out with kind of our overall thoughts on the set, and it looks like we've all got a little bit to say here, so Chris, I'll let you go ahead and kick off here with your initial impressions of Bloomburrow.
So it's really funny, a couple of the cards that we mentioned that have been like long time coming type cards from a classic card perspective, we're like not as high on as we used to be because there's been so much design and power creep since then, but I have, for as long as I can remember, wanted Jace the Mind Sculptor and Baleful Strix in my cube list, and this set gave us Birds of Paradise, Strix, Big Elspeth, and Mind Sculptor. And that's pretty cool to get to see if those cards work out the way that we want them to. The art and themes of this set appeal to me tremendously. This is like an all-time art set for me. It might be my favorite theme that they've ever done, straight up. I was excited about this, just like Tim was, but like they really knocked it out of the fist fucking park with this one. Just amazing art, really well executed. I'll probably try the limited format, like just for that very reason. And I also, like, we didn't talk a lot about the Kindred cards because they're not really for Cube, but I think the way that they approach the Kindred themes, instead of being like, hey, check it out, there's a bunch of small creatures with the same type, and then there's lords. It seems like they got creative with the Kindred themes. We couldn't talk about every card, obviously, but the set is like chock full of interesting designs that I think there are a lot of Cube curators out there doing a lot of different things with a lot of different themes that are going to find something to love here, whether it's tokens or +1/+1 counters or flicker. Sorry, I'm saying a lot, but like I love this set. And I really like that the UG theme or the blue-green theme is sort of like flicker, return stuff to hand. Not a lot of it like transfers well to generic Cube, but like blue-green is just always in limited sets like so boring, or the theme that they try just doesn't really like work or mesh with like any other blue-green themes. And I don't think that this really integrates well with like other historic blue-green themes, but it's like one of the more creative blue-green themes they've ever. Do you guys remember fractals from Strixhaven? You're making tokens with +1/+1 counters on them.
Math matters. Yeah, I remember Simic math matters.
Yeah, so like I just think that the design, it really feels like they put in good work and had good designers who gave a shit on this one, and I really like it.
I also have to say I really appreciated that this was the first set, and as long as I can remember, that didn't have like 15 random people showing up from other planes.
Yeah.
And, I mean, I guess technically on the courageous critters we did, but it felt nice to have like...
That's non-canonical, so that's fine.
Yeah, there's the Rao Otter and like some random dragon that's a legendary apparently, and that was it. That was the only randoms.
Don't worry, we'll get back to that with Duskmorn apparently.
Yeah,
I'm sure.
With Kaito Shizuki and Zamone as, fan favorite Magic character Zamone in Duskmorn. Teld, what are your overall impressions here of Bloodborne? What the hell is this set called? Bloomburrow. That's a different thing altogether.
Yeah, I mean, I think this set, as far as the retail limited set, looks really aggressive. There's a lot of really good one-drops and push combat tricks in this set. And that usually means the format's going to be fairly fast. So we'll see how it ends up playing out, but it looks relatively fast. Red, White Mice looked good. I agree. The art on this set was top-notch. From top to bottom, they had very few misses in this one, and they had a bunch of different art styles, too. Some of them looked like they were from, like, Peter Rabbit storybooks. Some of them looked straight out of Redwall. Some of them were more impressionistic, like Stargaze. And, there's some that were just, like, creepily wholesome, stuff like Stalk in the Pantry. So they just had like a really wide variety of different art styles that all kind of hit. There's a few misses in here, just like there always are, but there's my usual complaints of the art looking really digital and lame. Did it pan out here? And I think part of that I actually attribute to the fact that there are no humans on this plane, or no humanoids. Having to make everything like these furry little animals opened up the art design space to be a little more whimsical.
Part of the reason people seem to vibe with Lorwyn so much is it has that same no humans allowed kind of thing going on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the typal stuff was also done in a really, really cool way. Like Chris said, it's not just here's a bunch of creature types and here's some lords. There's a lot of crossover synergies between cards of the different colors. There's a lot of little mechanical synergies, and they're kind of isolated, but I saw at the pre-release of some crossovers that actually made sense. So this format might end up being a little deeper than maybe it looks on the surface of just 10 two-color pairs.
One thing that Teld said that I want to touch back on is, and again, I swear to God, they have an FBI agent assigned to us. They just don't want to pay us, but they're getting all of our best ideas, and they want to keep it that way. We've been talking a lot about how one-drops need to be more mechanically interesting, and how one-drops really haven't kept up with like the power creep of mid-cost cards, like all the crazy 3-drops they've been printing in the last couple of years. And the 2 one-drops that we got at the rarity, I think really fit that bill. They're very different than any other aggressive one-drops I've ever seen. Like we were literally just talking 2-3 months ago about how white or one-drop design in general probably needs to be readdressed to fit the context of like current Magic design, and it looks like they stole from us again.
Yeah, combat tricks and one drops are good in this set.
Combat tricks and one drops are good in this set. Look at
Wonder
that.
where they got that idea from.
Couldn't be us.
I can only echo like the positive stuff. Like I love the art direction. I love the theming of the set, and I actually love the theme of this set so much that it makes me. I wasn't really that worried about it, but this actually makes me like kind of dread the change that they're starting next year with replacing a mainline Magic set with a Universes Beyond set, because this set shows so much creativity in like Magic coming up with its own thing that every time I see a Universes Beyond set where I know there used to be a standard release set, I'm going to think like, oh, this could have been another Bloomburrow or something like that. And I mean, I get it. Like 30 years of card design, you gotta evolve somehow. So I get the Universes Beyond thing, but man, I'm gonna be really bummed when we start getting those sorts of things instead of things like this, because they just knocked it out of the park. They put love and care into this set, and you can see it in like everything down to the flavor text, which is something that people have complained about a lot recently. The flavor text is good in this set. Like, go read the flavor text. It's great.
It's real. Well, not only is it great, but because they did a lot of relatively clean designs, there was actually room for a lot of it on these cards.
Yeah, that's true. If I have to like come up with criticism, I don't have a lot, but like my only real criticism is how mechanically dense the set is. They basically have a different ability for all 10 color pairs, kind of like it was a Ravnica set or something. Some of them are keyworded, some of them are simple things like prowess, but like we probably could have done without Threshold. Honestly, I could have done without Gift. I do think the cards they made with Gift, they actually produced interesting cards to talk about and play with Gift, but it's weird to have a kicker mechanic on top of Offspring, which is a kicker mechanic. And I will say, I think the new mechanics, Valiant, I love Heroic, so Valiant is a big hit. Forage is interesting, at least as like a graveyard / food mechanic. Like it has a weird dynamic to it that's interesting. And Offspring to me is like an all-timer mechanic. I don't know when they're going to be able to use Offspring again, but it just feels like a very clean, intuitive mechanic that's easy to grok and produces really good cards. So
yeah.
9 out of 10. I love it. I'm sure the cards will end up playing out more powerful than we think they will. But yeah, I love this set, and I'm looking forward to the limited environment. I'm looking forward to the impact of these cards on Q. But that's basically my thoughts.
Yeah, my one criticism, and I realized this at pre-release, this would have been the perfect opportunity to reprint Thought Scour. And I say that in a completely unselfish, not wanting that at all for our cube. But it would have really tied the room together. It would have really tied the room together with Threshold and the Otter spells prowess tribal, right? That would have, we could have had just a little more mechanical cohesion and let us have Thought Scour for our cube. So
I actually have one criticism as well. Tim mentioned Offspring. I really like the themes and everything in the set, but there are a lot of really fucking irresponsible parents bringing child soldiers to the battlefield, and we all know how bad that is. We've all seen Blood Diamond. So,
is there a favorite card in the set, or a big question mark, or anything you're just really looking forward to playing? For me, I have two. My favorite card in the set. Well, my favorite card in the set is not actually in this review. It's that Bone Cache Overseer guy, but for our purposes, I think Kitsa, the blue looter, is just like slam dunk card. I'm really looking forward to seeing what it does. And then question mark / card I'm really hopeful about is the Ember Heart Challenger, the 2/2 prowess haste Valiant guy.
Yeah, one card I'm really interested to see how it's going to play out is one we actually didn't really talk about in this review, but we went in pretty detailed on the Peasant review, which is Heartfire Hero. Like, the more I think about the card, the more I think it could just be completely cracked for 1 mana. That card's so easy to make very powerful. Other than that, I mean, I think a lot of the designs of this set are sweet, but I tend to like cards more on the art. So I've already mentioned a bunch of the ones that I like.
So I do want to say first, the design is interesting. It's not a design that like makes me happy, but it's a really, really interesting design, is Beza, the Bounding Spring. And this art is just absolutely breathtaking. Like, the detail, it's very clearly hand done. It's loaded with detail. It's absolutely exquisite. Like, that one needs to be mentioned. And then the other one is, exactly what you would fucking think. It's Season of Loss. Also a card with incredible art, although not one I would hang in a room in my house that most people were allowed in, as I mentioned. But yeah, the flexibility, the combination of effects, just like what an interesting black card.
We got Dorian Gray here with his basement full of magic art that's not allowed for the masses to see.
That's where I keep my saddle and my whip.
I feel really uncomfortable with this set because this is like 2 of the last 3 sets that I've just been really excited and happy for. And what is this feeling? I don't get it.
When we're really old and decrepit and shaky, we'll all be in like a retirement home together in Seattle because we'll have finally gotten the jobs we deserve, and we'll just remember Bloomburrow, and it's like, you don't know the good years until they're gone. You know?
I miss Bloomburrow. Would you like to pay the 1, Chris?
As we're playing our Universes Beyond Transformers Unicron set and drafting Carl. Anyway, let's go ahead and close this bad boy out. Thanks as always to everyone listening. Remember, the best way to support Jank Diver Gaming and the Jank Tank podcast is to join the Discord server. Come draft with us. Give us your feedback. It's a great place to hang out with like-minded individuals, talk about Q, Retail Limited, all things Magic, especially when the new sets drop. You'll get a lot of cubing in. There'll be perfect time for feedback. And you'll often have people midday, later at night, streaming their retail drafts, which is always fun to get in on. Think about the Jank Diver Gaming Discord as your online LGS. You can find links to our Discord server wherever you're listening to this podcast. We have scheduled drafts throughout the week. The mainline cube, which is the focus of what we've been talking about today, we draft that on Sundays and Wednesday nights, 7:30 Eastern. The peasant cube, which is our upcoming bonus episode that we've talked about, that is drafted Saturday nights. We have F&M style drafts on Friday where players vote on the cube that they want to play. And we have various Jank Diver cubes and user-submitted guest cubes on Saturday and Sunday mornings. You can check out our socials, Twitter at Jank Diver Gaming, youtube.com/Jank Diver Gaming. I think Teld is working on our peasant review for the YouTube channel. And then you can find Teld talking on twitch.tv/Teld Talks, Teld Talks. That's it for Bloomburrow. And we probably get like a week or two's reprieve before Duskmorn comes out. I think it's literally the end of like September or something.
Don't say that to me.
And then right after that, it's Foundations.
Yeah, Foundations is November. So we're in that old deep dive grind of like set review, topic. What topic do we want to talk about? We have one episode, set review. Yeah. The grind is real, but that's going to go ahead and do it for the Bloomburrow review. Thanks for hanging out. Come let us know what you think of the cards, and we will catch you all next time. Hello, Christopher Sofsky, and thank you for joining me today on my podcast, High Level Card Evaluations. Today I'll be presenting a few Magic cards, and I'd like you to tell the audience what you think of these cards. To get started, I'd like to get your opinion on a Magic the Gathering classic, Blood Artist.
I think the best home for this card is in like a black sacrifice deck.
Very insightful and absolutely correct. As a follow-up, what are your thoughts on the comparable but sometimes controversial Zulaport Cutthroat?
I think the best home for this card is in like a black sacrifice deck.
Absolutely, couldn't agree more. Now, you're probably aware of the current problems surrounding Nadu and the way it's affected Modern, Commander, and basically every format it's currently legal in. What are your thoughts on Nadu Winged Wisdom?
I think the best home for this card is in like a black sacrifice deck.
Superb, Chris. Superb. And what about Craterhoof Behemoth? It's a fan favorite, closes out games in green decks, and has a bit of a combo element to it. How do you evaluate a top-end mono-green win condition like this?
I think the best home for this card is in like a black sacrifice deck.
Stellar evaluation, Christopher. I understand you have an affinity for black sacrifice decks, and it really shows in this interview. But before we go, do you have any thoughts you'd like to share on colors outside of black?
Some of the dumbest cards ever made are Simic.
Truly phenomenal. Well, listeners, that was a brief sit-down with Christopher Sofsky. I hope you've learned as much today as I have, and I wish you all well. To close things out, I have just one final question. Hey, Teld, what does the fox say?
Mine, minds.